Part 2 End of Innocence 2175 to 1541 BC. Our view of ancient Egypt is profoundly shaped by the surviving monuments. The Old Kingdom with its pyramids and the New Kingdom with its temples and tombs loom large in the popular imagination, while the centuries in between, largely devoid of monumental architecture, are barely acknowledged, a forgotten dark age. Yet the social and political developments that took place during this neglected period had a deep and lasting effect on the trajectory of ancient Egyptian history. The weaknesses of a hereditary monarchy, the threat posed by climate change, the dangers of uncontrolled immigration, and the unforeseen consequences of closer foreign ties, all were brought home to the Egyptians in harsh lessons that would test their civilization to the breaking point. Amid this chaos, however, Egypt witnessed a second great cultural flowering. The Middle Kingdom was the golden age of literature, when many of the great classics were composed. From the heroic tale of Sinuhe to the rollicking yarn of the shipwrecked sailor, from the overtly propagandist prophecies of Nefertiti to the subtle rhetoric of the eloquent peasant, and from the metaphysical dispute between a man and his soul to the burlesque satire of the trades, the literary output of the Middle Kingdom reveals ancient Egyptian society at its most complex and sophisticated. Archaeological evidence is prosaic and unsentimental, whereas the surviving writings of the ancient Egyptians allow us to enter into their imaginations, to see the world as they saw it. For this reason the Middle Kingdom seems more immediate, more tangible than many other periods of Egyptian history. For once, we can taste its flavor. It was also a time of unrivaled craftsmanship in jewelry and statuary, of international trade and conquest. The city of Thebes rose from provincial obscurity to a position of national prominence. Much of Nubia was conquered and annexed. Egypt emerged on the world stage, foreshadowing its later imperial expansion. The end of the Pyramid Age and the collapse of central authority in the First Intermediate Period might have presaged the terminal decline of ancient Egypt. In fact, they brought about a renaissance, albeit one with a harder edge. Part 2 traces the extraordinary ups and downs of Egyptian civilization in the 6 centuries between the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the New Kingdom. For the pharaonic state, court culture, and the lives of ordinary Egyptians it was a rollercoaster ride, from political fragmentation and civil war to the restoration of centralized control and cultural renewal, then foreign invasion and the threat of total extinction. In such turbulent times, the Egyptians' illusions about their place in the world were rudely shattered. Yet far from undermining pharaonic civilization, this collective loss of confidence in the old certainties proved a fertile breeding ground for new ideas. So, too, did the rise of the regions and the influence of local traditions. Afterlife beliefs and burial customs, in particular, underwent profound changes in this climate of innovation, with concepts previously reserved for the king being adopted by the wider population, then adapted, elaborated, and codified. In an uncertain world, the promise of an afterlife for all offered a grain of comfort. The result was a set of tenets and practices that would endure for the rest of ancient Egyptian history and influence later religions, including Christianity. In the political sphere, the shock of civil war and its lingering aftermath prompted a security clampdown and the introduction of repressive measures throughout the Nile Valley. Despotic, autocratic rule was the prevailing zeitgeist of the Middle Kingdom. More than any other period of pharaonic history, it challenges our rose-tinted view of ancient Egypt. Chapter 6 Civil War Après-moi le déluge. The death of Pepi II in 2175, after a reign of record length, provoked a dynastic crisis more serious than anything Egypt had faced since the foundation of the state, nearly 1,000 years earlier. Disputes over the succession had flared up periodically during the Old Kingdom, but even in the aftermath of palace coups, the powerful forces of conservatism within the royal court had always managed to reimpose order and restore the status quo. This time it was different. Pepi's designated successor, his son Nemtiemsf II, did indeed ascend to the throne, but his reign was short. He must have been a very old man himself by the time his centenarian father died. The next ruler, Nitocrates Sipta, was of uncertain descent, and we cannot even be certain about gender. The name suggests a man, but later tradition identified Nitocrates as a reigning queen. It was symptomatic of the confusion that now descended on the royal family, the government, and Egypt as a whole. State-building projects ground to a halt, and so did foreign expeditions in search of booty. Preoccupied with troubles at home, the faltering government had no appetite for adventures abroad. At the remote outpost of Ain Asil, in the Dakhla oasis, for generations a bulwark against foreign infiltration, arson gutted the governor's palace and destroyed part of the northern town. The desert outposts were abandoned, and with them Egypt's forward defenses. The civilization of the pyramid builders had reached a nadir. After Nitocrates, who left no monuments or even inscriptions, the throne passed from one weak ruler to another, as almost anyone with a drop of royal blood in their veins, and no doubt several individuals who had none, pressed their claim. In a period of just 20 years, Less than a generation after Pepi II's demise, Egypt saw 17 kings come and go. 10 of their reigns together spanned a trifling 6 years. Little wonder that later chroniclers were heartily confused and ended up inventing a wholly spurious 7th dynasty. Not that the 8th, those 17 ephemeral monarchs in succession to Nemtiamsf II, was really worthy of the title. 5 of its kings tried vainly to project an air of legitimacy by adopting the throne name of Pepi II, Neferkara, as their own. 1 looked back to an even earlier king of the 5th dynasty, but all succumbed in short order to the force of rival claimants. Most of the royal inscriptions that have survived from this extraordinary phase of ancient Egyptian history are dated to the first year of a king's reign. It is as if, knowing that he was unlikely to last long in the post, each new ruler got down to business as quickly as possible, exercising what little authority remained to him before it was stolen away. So we see an otherwise unknown King Iti sponsoring a quarrying expedition to the Wadi Hammamat, to bring back stone for a pyramid that was never built. Another ruler, Imhotep, sent expeditions both as crown prince and as king but likewise left no permanent memorial. The only king of the 8th dynasty who managed both to survive more than a year in office, 2 years, 1 month, and a day, to be precise, and to leave behind a monument of sorts was Ebi. From the 5th dynasty onward, Egyptian monarchs seem to have had a curious fondness for personal names that sound babyish to our ears, from Izzi and Ini to Teti and Pepi, Nebi, Iti, and Ebi. Perhaps this tells us something about the cosseted atmosphere inside the royal apartments. We can well imagine the feverish activity that gripped the court and what remained of the royal workshops when the newly enthroned king announced his plans for a pyramid at Saqqara, traditional burial place of monarchs since the time of Nefertiti. Recent experience showed that time was of the essence. In response to the new realities of kingship, Ebi's architects proposed a monument that might be completed before the wheel of fortune turned once more, bringing yet another ruler to power. The result was hardly a pyramid at all in the expected sense of the word. Although sited in deliberate proximity to the pyramid of Pepi II, it was diminutive by the standards of the Old Kingdom. At 103 feet, 60 ancient Egyptian cubits, square at the base, and with a projected height of just 60 feet, it was the same size as the pyramids of Pepi II's queens, quite a come down for someone claiming to be the son of Ra. To facilitate the speediest possible construction, the core was built from mud, small stones, and chips of limestone, hardly a recipe for stability or longevity. The descending corridor and underground burial chamber were carved with selections from the pyramid texts, and a mud brick chapel was built against the pyramid's eastern face to serve as a mortuary temple. But the outer casing was never even started. Time had caught up with Ebi. He would be the only one of Pepi II's direct successors even to attempt pyramid building. In other ways, too, in defiance of its own impotence, the administration carried on in public as if nothing had changed. The most remarkable documents to survive from the 8th dynasty are a collection of royal decrees from the Temple of Min at Geb on the east bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt. Since prehistoric times, Geb had flourished as the gateway to the eastern desert and its abundant mineral resources. The local fertility god, Min, had been adopted as a national deity early in Egyptian history, and his cult center received royal patronage from the very beginning of the First Dynasty. Toward the end of the Old Kingdom, Pepi I and Pepi II added to the temple buildings and endowments. Their successors of the late 8th dynasty maintained this tradition, but to very different ends. King Neferkara, for instance, issued 3 decrees for public display in the temple. Their purpose was not to augment the temple's estates or safeguard its personnel from government service, but something altogether more practical and political, to announce the promotion of a royal lackey, Shemai, to the governorship of Upper Egypt. Shemai would have responsibility for all 22 provinces from the First Cataract to the outskirts of Memphis, and to confirm the succession of his son, Idi, as nomarch, provincial governor, of Geb. The weak rulers of the 8th dynasty needed all the friends they could muster, and were not averse to using royal privilege to honor and reward their supporters in the regions. This debasement of monarchy was carried even further by Neferkara's successor, Neferkauhor. In the space of a single day, probably the very day of his accession to the throne, circa 2155, the king issued no fewer than 8 decrees to be displayed in the temple at Geb. All 8 were again concerned with promoting and honoring Shemai and members of his family. Shemai himself was promoted to the office of vizier, while his son succeeded him as governor of Upper Egypt, albeit with a considerably reduced remit. Another son was appointed to a position on the temple staff, a decision commemorated in 3 separate decrees, one addressed to each male member of the family. A further edict assigned mortuary priests to Shemai and his wife, a privilege previously reserved only for royalty. In a similar vein, their funerary monuments were made from red granite, a material with strong solar connotations and subject to a royal monopoly. The reason for all these honors was made plain in the first of Neferkauhor's decrees, in which he stipulated the titles and dignities to be borne by Shemai's wife, Nebet. For she was none other than the king's eldest daughter and the king's sole favorite. As soon as Neferkauhor gained the throne, he clearly decided to use his brief period of power to shower his immediate relatives with awards and royal favors. It was the classic behavior of a tinpot dictator. The last of the Gebtu decrees, dated to the reign of Neferkauhor's successor Neferukara, forbade anyone to damage the funerary monuments of Shemai and Nebet's son Idi, now promoted to vizier, or to diminish his offerings. Though issued from the national capital, it was the last gasp of the Memphite monarchy. Its craven favoritism signaled the almost abject dependence of the pharaohs at Memphis upon the loyalty of the powerful landed nobility of Upper Egypt. Despite the apparent maintenance of economic stability and the associated prosperity of local cults like that of Min at Gebtu, royal power was waning fast. In the person of Neferukara, named after an illustrious monarch of the 5th dynasty, but in reality a king of shreds and patches, the system of royal government that had served Egypt for a millennium had come to an inglorious end. The political elite and the country at large were totally unprepared for what might follow. Big men, big ideas. With the collapse of central authority, Egypt fragmented along regional lines, returning to the pattern that had existed before the foundation of the state 1,000 years earlier. As before, the geography of the Nile Valley, in particular the distribution of irrigation basins, was the main determining factor. The 3 southernmost provinces formed one natural unit, provinces 4 and 5 another, and so on downriver. The political and economic aggrandizement of the provincial governors, nomarchs, a process that had started centuries earlier, reached its logical conclusion as various local potentates declared de facto independence. However, kingship as a model of government was so ingrained in the Egyptian psyche that its replacement by something different was philosophically and theologically impossible. So it was inevitable that one of this new cohort of rulers, even if his authority was strictly limited in extent, would claim royal titles and be acknowledged, grudgingly, as suzerain, or, rather, first among equals, by his fellow leaders. The strong man who achieved this recognition of sorts came from the town of Heracleopolis, modern Inasaya el Medina, in Middle Egypt. Gyp named Keti, he was said by the later Egyptian historian Manetho to have been more terrible than any previous king, this verdict reflecting, perhaps, a would-be dynast who pursued his claim to the throne by force, browbeating any opposition into submission. The house of Keti would reign for a century and a half, 2125 to 1975 reign, but not rule. Even in its own realm the new dynasty was not universally acknowledged or approved. At the heart of Heracleopolitan power, a local potentate with royal pretensions, King Kui, built a massive mud brick tomb, equal in size to many Old Kingdom pyramids, and this act of daring leaves Majesté just a stone's throw from Saudi, modern Asyut, the city most loyal to the Heracleopolitan dynasty. At the nearby alabaster quarries of Hatnub, the nomarchs dated their expeditions by the years of their own tenure, avoiding all reference to a royal reign. In their tomb autobiographies at Beni Hassan and elsewhere, officials rarely if ever mentioned the king, and were conspicuously silent about their own careers, completely out of character for an ancient Egyptian, and a sure sign of wavering loyalties. With such unpopularity in their heartland, Keti and his descendants were living in a dream world if they imagined their nominal authority would remain unchallenged for long. What dealt their authority a fatal blow was the dynasty's inability to carry out the most basic duty of kingship, to feed the people. A series of low Niles had weakened the state economy in the reign of Pepi II. Now, in the absence of an effective national government, the long-term effects of poor inundations started to be felt. Famine stalked the land, challenging the ability of provincial governors to look after their own citizens. Some undoubtedly played up the crisis to further their own careers. By acting the savior in a time of trouble, they won both local support and wider renown. A man named Mur boasted that I buried the dead and fed the living wherever I went in this famine that happened. To a contemporary, iti, let it be known that he fed his hometown, Imatru, in the painful years and gave Upper Egyptian barley to Ioni and to Hefat, but only, after feeding Imatru. 3 Anktifi, governor of the 3rd Upper Egyptian province, with its capital at Hefat, modern Mualla, went even further, claiming to have sent emergency aid supplies to affected areas from Abju, in the north, to Abu, in the south. He presented himself as the natural leader of the 7 southernmost provinces, the very same region that had been assigned to the governor of Upper Egypt in the dying days of the 8th dynasty. If he had proved himself capable of looking after the population when all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, then surely he was qualified to be their political master as well. Indeed, Ang-Tifi's long-term ambitions stretched far beyond his own province. In his tomb at Hefat, cut into the side of a natural hill shaped like a pyramid, the only fitting resting place for a true Egyptian ruler, he inscribed the details of his career, so that all posterity might remember his achievements. Ang-Tifi had shown an early talent for calculated maneuvers. Even before gaining high office, he had invited the Council of the Overseer of Upper Egypt, based at Chini, to carry out a visit of inspection of his province. No doubt this had given him the opportunity to curry favor with the Heracleopolitan government and, at the same time, to assess its strengths and weaknesses. Having weighed the likely opposition, Ang-Tifi had begun his steady rise to power as soon as he'd succeeded as nomarch. First, he'd annexed the neighboring province of Jeba, under the pretense of rescuing it from mismanagement, always a convenient excuse for a land grab. In his own version of events, he displaced the previous governor, Ku, in accordance with divine providence. Ang-Tifi then proceeded to form a strategic alliance, no doubt backed up with the threat of force, with the province of Abu, to give him effective control of the three southernmost provinces. Together, these provinces formed the perfect springboard for his wider territorial ambitions, and all the while Ang-Tifi publicly maintained his loyalty to the king in Heracleopolis. But while Jeba and Abu had proved relatively easy to bring to heel, the fourth and fifth nomes, based at Thebes and Gebtu, were an entirely different proposition, not least because they had formed a defensive alliance against just such an attack. Massing his forces on his northern border, Ang-Tifi launched an assault against the province of Thebes. His army destroyed the garrison fortress at INNOCENCE and roamed at will through the desert to the west of Thebes, the city's back door. The Thebans refused to come out and engage the enemy, biding their time. Ang-Tifi took this reticence as a sign of weakness, but he could not have been more wrong. Within a few years, all three of Ang-Tifi's provinces would fall under Theban domination. Thebes, not Hefat, would be the launchpad for a campaign of national reunification. Theban ascendancy ostensibly, the governor of the Theban province, too, was loyal to the Heracleopolitan overlord. Ang-Tifi's contemporary, Intef the Great of Thebes, publicly professed himself the beloved of the king. He even agreed to Thebes' being represented at a great conference of nomarchs summoned by the Heracleopolitan authorities, perhaps in response to Ang-Tifi's military aggression. It is significant that Intef did not himself attend, instead sending the overseer of his army. By participating, but not in person, Intef delivered a carefully calculated message to his fellow nomarchs and the Heracleopolitan king. Here was a ruler with a substantial private army who had better, and more pressing, things to do with his time than sit around a table with mere provincial governors. Protestations of fealty were easily made. They did not change the fact that Intef was busily engaged in strategic maneuvers to strengthen Thebes and position it as the head of a grand alliance. A strong signal of Intef's true intentions was his adoption of the title Great Overlord of Upper Egypt, not merely of Thebes. At least one other province, that of INNOCENCE, understood the message and threw its weight behind Intef, recognizing his authority as a regional power broker. INNOCENCE's defection was a serious blow to the Heracleopolitan kingdom. Ever since the rise of the House of Keti, the province of INNOCENCE had been steadfastly loyal to the dynasty. Its governor had ensured the continued allegiance not only of his own province, but of the two neighboring provinces as well. Now, with Theban power in the ascendant, the Heracleopolitans faced the secession of their entire southern domain. Their response was highly political and potentially incendiary, the installation of a loyal governor in the province of Gebtu, sandwiched between Thebes, to the south, and INNOCENCE, to the north. In reality, there were few other options but to keep a tight watch on Theban ambitions. The new appointee, User, recognized the importance of his task and moved his provincial capital from the traditional seat at Gebtu to the town of Yushinshan, modern Kazam, right on the boundary with the Theban province. From here, he could literally look the enemy in the eye. The province of Gebtu was of great strategic importance. Not only was it the gateway to the eastern desert, but its leaders also exercised jurisdiction over the routes through the western desert. These led to the Saharan oases, departing the Nile Valley from a point on the west bank directly opposite Yushinshan. User and his royal masters knew very well that Thebes had already established a military presence in the western desert, since the Thebans had contributed a desert garrison to the defensive alliance against Ang-Tifi. It was vital that they should not be allowed to expand this toehold. If Thebes ever won control of the western desert routes, its rulers would be able to bypass any opposition along the Nile Valley and gain direct overland access to the holy city of Abju, jewel in the Heracleopolitan crown and seat of the governor of Upper Egypt. Such a calamity would surely be the beginning of the end for the House of Keti. Responding to the situation, as ever, with a carefully calculated piece of propaganda, Intef of Thebes announced his intentions by adding yet another new title to his growing list of epithets. He was nothing if not a typical ancient Egyptian. By calling himself the confidant of the king in the narrow door of the southern desert, 6 he was directly challenging User's role as overseer of the eastern and western deserts. The Thebes-Gebtu alliance, always a marriage of convenience, was formally dissolved. In its place, the two provinces now vied openly for control of the all-important desert routes. Before long, the war of words escalated into outright conflict. Thebes launched a raid across the border, destroying the town of Irshenshan. Gebtu put up stiff resistance, expelling the invaders and capturing some of their soldiers. The chief priest of Gebtu ordered the rebuilding of Irshenshan, but there could be little doubt that this was only the first salvo in what would be a protracted campaign of Theban aggression. The people of Gebtu steeled themselves for the fight they knew must come. Prominent among the prisoners of war captured during the attack on Irshenshan were people of Media and Wawat, Nubian mercenaries serving in the Theban army. Ever since Egypt's campaigns against the sand dwellers in the early 6th dynasty, Nubian recruits had played an important role in Egyptian military strategy. Nubian archers, especially, were noted for their bravery and prowess. Many a young Nubian man knew he could achieve far greater wealth and renown by joining a foreign army than by staying in his impoverished homeland. The role of the Nepalese Gurkhas in the British Army is an instructive modern parallel. While all factions in the conflicts of the First Intermediate Period may have employed Nubian mercenaries to a greater or lesser extent, only the Thebans made them a central element in their offensive capability. An entire colony of Nubian soldiers was established at Inerti, on the southern edge of the Theban province. While adopting Egyptian burial customs, they nevertheless retained a strong sense of their own cultural identity, an unusual exception to the normal pattern of complete assimilation. Clearly, their status in society as brave warriors was enhanced by the very fact of their Nubian ethnicity. In time of war, old prejudices were dissipating. Egyptian civilization was being transformed from the inside in unexpected ways. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. User's successor as nomarch of Gebtu, a man named Jati, was as determined a leader as his royal masters could have wished for. Jati's exploits in resisting Theban expansion have only recently come to light, inscribed on a remote cliffside in the western desert. The inscription tells of his heroic struggle to keep the desert routes open to Heracleopolitan forces, and his implacable opposition to Thebes. Styling himself the confidant of the king in the door of the Upper Egyptian Desert 7, a title deliberately antagonistic to Intef's own claims, Jati threw down a direct challenge to his Theban opponent. Both sides knew that the western desert routes across the Great Gena Bend were the key objective. In Theban hands, Abju and all of Middle Egypt would be vulnerable to attack. In Heracleopolitan hands, the main population centers of western Thebes would be dangerously exposed. It must have come as a bitter blow to the morale of Gebtu when Intef, the great successor as Theban leader, another Intef, the popularity of the name at this time can be decidedly confusing, seized control of an important mountaintop overlooking the main desert road, effectively closing it to traffic. Jati's response was immediate and inspired. He simply constructed another parallel road, a short distance to the north, with its eastern terminus safely within the territory of Gebtu. In his own words, "I have done this in order to cross this hill country that the ruler of another province sealed." But Jati's success was to be short-lived. Ironically, his decisive action in building a new, improved desert road was the cause of his own downfall. Just a few yards away from his commemorative inscription is another, much shorter text. It reads, simply, "The son of Ra, Intef." It marks the Theban capture of Jati's new road, no doubt in a swift operation launched from one of their desert garrisons. With Gebtu's control of the western desert swept away, nothing now stood between Thebes and Abju, the administrative capital of Upper Egypt and the ancient burial place of kings. In this context, Intef's new title, son of Ra, is highly significant. Unlike his predecessors, he was not merely content with the style and dignity of a provincial or even regional governor. He now aspired to kingship. By claiming the ancient moniker of sovereign for himself, King Intef had issued a direct challenge to the house of Keti. The prize was nothing less than the throne of Horus. On the front line, confident the Thebans might have been, but their opponents were not about to give up the kingship without a fight. The Egyptian civil war, once formally declared, dragged on for more than a century, 2080 to 1970, coloring the lives of 4 generations. The martial character of the age is powerfully reflected in the monuments of the time. In tombs, scenes of soldiers are common. On stele, commemorative slabs, many individuals had themselves shown with bow and arrow in hand, and grave goods often included actual weapons. Never before had Egyptian society been so militarized. It is also unusual that a number of commemorative inscriptions from both sides of the conflict allow us to reconstruct the progress of the war, with its victories and setbacks for the Thebans and Heracleopolitans alike. Winning control of the desert routes across the Gena Bend seems to have been the principal achievement of the first king Intef. In any case, his self-styled reign lasted little more than a decade, but he had at least made a decisive strategic breakthrough, providing a platform for further Theban expansion. His son and successor, Intef II, lost no time in picking up the baton and prosecuting the war with a renewed intensity. His evident charisma and leadership qualities inspired fanatical loyalty among his closest lieutenants. 1. Henny, boasts Ophi YG, having attended his master day and night. Such devotion made for a close-knit fighting force, and brought swift success. But before Thebes could be confident in taking on the might of the loyalist forces north of Abju, it had to secure its southern flank. So the first objective was to consolidate Theban control over the erstwhile power base of Anktifi. Either late in the nomarch's life or shortly after his death, the local population saw the writing on the wall and threw in their lot with Thebes. The famine, which may still have been raging, and the general impoverishment suffered by the population may have been contributory factors. The people clearly felt that their future would be more secure, or less insecure, if they were Intef II's liege men. At the same time, Thebes succeeded in expanding its control northward to encompass the three neighboring provinces of Gebtu, Ayunet, and Hut-Sekem. In fulfillment of the claim made by his grandfather, Intef the Great, Intef II was now truly the great overlord of Upper Egypt, and recognized as such throughout the head of the south, the 7 southernmost provinces from Abu to the outskirts of Abju. Hence, by the middle of Intef II's reign, circa 2045, the northern border of the Theban realm lay close to Abju. Tar, the province of Chini, became the new front line in the civil war, and the desert routes that gave direct access between Thebes and Abju finally came into their own. One Theban supporter records a military expedition traveling in the dust to attack Tar, 9, while another recounts the ensuing battle and the expulsion of the Heracleopolitan's loyal governor. I descended upon Abju, which was under the control of a rebel. I made him go down to his own realm from the midst of the town. Kenneth is telling that the language of the Thebans has already shifted from rivalry to restoration. The case for Theban hegemony could be made to appear so much more compelling if the Heracleopolitan dynasty, which considered itself the legitimate successor of the Old Kingdom monarchy, were characterized as the rebel. Theban expansion could then be cast as the removal of an affront to established order. Representing power as piety was always a favorite trick of ancient Egyptian propagandists. To reinforce their military victory, the Thebans imposed taxes throughout Tar and delivered the revenue back to Thebes. Buoyed by this success, Intef II used his control of Abu to strike southward into Lower Nubia, reimposing Egyptian authority over the lands beyond the First Cataract for the first time in more than a century. The Theban advance seemed unstoppable. But events have a habit of turning against those who think themselves invincible. At Saudi, in Middle Egypt, a family of nomarchs with particularly close connections to the Heracleopolitan rulers now took up the loyalist banner to fight against the upstart Thebans. Back in the days before the civil war, Saudi had been governed by a man named, in honor of his sovereign, Keti. He had been brought up in the royal circle as a pupil of the king and had even received swimming lessons with the royal children. On achieving high office, Keti had devoted himself to improving the lot of his people, commissioning extensive irrigation works throughout his province to alleviate the worst effects of the famine. In his tomb is the inscription, "I let loose the inundation upon the old mounds. Everyone who thirsted had inundation to his heart's desire. I gave water to his neighbors so that he was content with them." 11 This Keti's successor, Itibi, now found himself confronted by an even greater challenge, Theban aggression, and he was equally determined to triumph over adversity. So he responded to Intef II's raid on Abju with a fierce counterattack. This achieved its primary objective of wresting back control of Tar, but at a dreadful cost. The holy site of Abju was desecrated during the fighting. Such an act of sacrilege was a grievous stain on the mantle of kingship, a transgression against the gods for which the Heracleopolitan monarch would repent at length. It would come to be seen in later times as the event that finally tipped the balance in favor of Thebes. But the immediate result was a victory for Itibi's forces. An attempted Theban reprisal was repulsed, and this second success gave Itibi the confidence to issue a direct communique to the head of the south, in which he threatened further force unless the rebellious provinces returned to the loyalist fold. Itibi's own autobiography tells the story of what happened next. The section containing his written challenge to the southern nomes was subsequently plastered over, to hide it from view and thus avoid Theban reprisals against the townspeople of Saudi for harboring such a determined opponent. Whether this tactical rewriting of history was carried out on the orders of Itibi himself or on the orders of his descendants, it suggests that, not long after his famous victories, the pendulum swung back again to Thebes' advantage. The reversal of fortune was due, in no small measure, to Intef II's skill as a military strategist. He soon realized that Tar was a potential quagmire for his army. Trying to capture and hold on to Abju could easily pin down his forces for years, allowing the Heracleopolitan forces to strengthen and regroup. A flanking maneuver, bold and dangerous as it might be, was the only way to break the impasse. Once Tar had been severed from the rest of the Heracleopolitan realm, it would be far easier to pacify. In the last decade of his long 50-year reign, Intef II put his plan into action. Using his command of desert routes to advance around Tar, he established a new defensive position 2 provinces to the north. Cut off from assistance, Chini and Abju proved much easier targets and were swiftly conquered. To mark his victory, Intef sent a letter to his rival in Heracleopolis, accusing King Keti of having raised a storm over Tar. The message was clear. By failing to protect the sacred sites of Abju, Keti had forfeited his right to the kingship. By contrast, Intef was determined to show that he was a just king as well as a mighty conqueror. Fierce in battle, magnanimous in victory, he demonstrated his determination to win the battle for hearts and minds by distributing food aid throughout the 10 provinces of his new realm. In this way, one of his close associates could claim to be a great provider for the homeland in a lean year. 12 Naturally, there was a good measure of psychological warfare in such pronouncements. But Intef's piety seems to have been genuine. His magnificent funerary stela, erected in his rock-cut tomb at Thebes, is noteworthy not for its list of battle honors, the events of the civil war are conspicuous by their absence, but for its extraordinary hymn to the sun god Ra and to Hathor, the protector goddess who was believed to reside in the Theban hills. The verse hints at a human frailty and a fear of death lying behind the visage of a great war leader. The death of a king was always a moment of great anxiety. How much more worrying it must have been for the Thebans when the king departing the throne was a war hero of the caliber of Intef II. And yet, a rare account of the moment of succession, recorded by the king's treasurer, Chiji, suggests a calm transition from one reign to the next. The dual king, son of Ra, Intef, who lives like Ra forever, departed in peace to his horizon. Now when his son had descended in his place, I followed him. 14 In fact, the new king, Intef III, was to enjoy but a brief reign of 8 years, 2018 to 2010. Theban overlordship of the deserts brought tribute from the rulers upon the Red Land, the desert chieftains, and the famine that had racked Upper Egypt for more than 50 years seems to have been brought to an end. But while the economy prospered, the prosecution of the war stalled. An uneasy truce may have settled over the battlefield. Theban dominance in the 8 southernmost provinces was absolute. Heracleopolitan rule over Middle and Lower Egypt remained unchallenged. And so it might easily have stayed, but for the fact that a divided nation was anathema to the ancient Egyptian worldview. Any king worthy of the name had to be lord of the 2 lands, not merely a provincial potentate. Reunification and repression. The final confrontation was not long in coming. Intef III was succeeded by a young, dynamic ruler who had inherited his grandfather's tactical skill and determination. Indeed, the new king, Mentuhotep II, had been named after the Theban god of war, Montu, and was determined to live up to his billing. He chose as his Horus name the phrase Sankibtai, the one who brings life to the heart of the 2 lands. It clearly signaled his overriding aspiration to reunify Egypt. Mentuhotep was helped enormously by unrest in the enemy's heartland. The Nuno March of Saudi, Keti II, was encountering serious opposition within his own province. Only a show of force by the crown and the personal attendance of the Heracleopolitan king Merakara allowed the governor's installation to go ahead. The population of Saudi was starting to think the unthinkable, weighing the advantages of defection to the Theban side. Their embattled No March sailed southward at the head of a large fleet, partly as a show of force against the Thebans, partly to prove a point to his own restless population. Then, in Mentuhotep's 14th year as king, circa 1996, Tar, that persistent thorn in the Theban side, rebelled yet again. It was the final provocation. The Theban army swept northward, crushing Tar and pushing onward into the Heracleopolitan heartland. Saudi was vanquished and its nomarch deposed. Nothing now stood between the Thebans and their ultimate prize, Heracleopolis itself. When Mentuhotep's army reached the capital of the House of Keti, they gave full vent to their wrath, burning and destroying tombs in the city's cemetery. To drive home the point, the Theban king immediately installed one of his most trusted followers as his personal representative in Heracleopolis, putting him in charge of the city's most important building, its prison. That was the fate that lay in store for any rebel unfortunate enough not to have died in battle. The ruthless treatment meted out by Mentuhotep to his opponents did not stop at the gates of Heracleopolis. In the heart of troublesome Tar, he appointed an overseer of constabulary on water and on land, 15 suggesting a law and order crackdown against the inhabitants of this most unruly province. Another of Mentuhotep's henchmen boasts of taxing Tar, Shani, and, as far as, the back part of the 10th Upper Egyptian province 16 for his master. This smacks of punitive economic sanctions against formerly hostile territory. Heracleopolitan loyalists who tried to escape retribution by fleeing to the oases were remorselessly hunted down. They had forgotten the Theban's mastery of desert routes. The king himself addressed his victorious troops, urging them to pursue troublemakers, and move to annex the oases and Lower Nubia. A garrison installed in the fortress at Abu provided Mentuhotep with a springboard for campaigns against Wawat, while expeditions into the western desert were highly effective at disrupting potential enemy supply lines and mopping up any lingering resistance. His external borders secured, the king could now turn his attention to matters of internal government. Situated on the east bank of the Nile at a place where cross-country routes through the eastern and western deserts converged, the town of Thebes had first come to prominence. At the end of the Old Kingdom, with excellent communication links, it made a natural capital for the whole of Upper Egypt. The role of its first family in the recent civil war had merely strengthened its claim to preeminent status. The town itself was still rather small and enclosed by a thick mud brick wall. The tightly packed streets of houses, granaries, offices, and workshops clustered in a grid pattern around the small temple of the god Amun-Ra at Ipizit, modern Karnak. Like any provincial capital, Thebes had its own local administration. At its head was the mayor, assisted by officials responsible for such essential government tasks as land registration, irrigation and flood protection schemes, and taxation. Since Thebes was a commercial center of some importance, the quays along the river thronged with merchants, unloading their goods for purchase by government agents and private customers. Potters, carpenters, weavers, and tanners, butchers, bakers, and brewers, the back streets of Thebes were filled with the sights, sounds, and smells of craft and food production, much like the back streets of any Egyptian town today. Most inhabitants were peasant farmers who lived in simple mud brick dwellings and spent every day tilling the fields, as countless generations of their forebears had done, but the city also played host to a rising number of better-off families, a nascent middle class of tradesmen and lower-ranking bureaucrats with larger houses in the smarter neighborhoods. Had Thebes been any other provincial center, the inhabitants' horizons might have stayed rather limited, but with the city catapulted to national prominence, opportunities for advancement mushroomed. The good times had arrived. Under Mentuhotep, the dynastic seat was formally established as the new national capital, and prominent Thebans were appointed to all the major offices of state. Administrative reforms were soon followed by theological ones. To mark the final phase in the civil war, the king had changed his Horus name to Net-Jeri-Hejet, divine of the white crown, and he now embarked on a radical program of self-promotion and self-deification, designed to restore and rebuild the ideology of divine kingship that had taken such a battering in the years of internal strife. From Abju and Ayunet to Nekep and Abu, Mentuhotep commissioned a series of ornate cult buildings, more often than not dedicated to himself as the god's chosen one. At Ayunet, he adopted the unprecedented epithet of the living god, foremost of kings. Deification of the reigning king during his lifetime marked a new departure in royal ideology. Mentuhotep was clearly not a man for half measures. He also used these monuments to send a stark political message to any remaining would-be rebels in Egypt's northern provinces. His chapel at Ayunet showed him in the age-old pose of smiting an enemy. But the symbolic victim was represented as a pair of intertwined stems of papyrus, symbolizing Lower Egypt. The accompanying inscription emphasized the point, adding the marshlands to the traditional list of Egypt's enemies. A relief from Mentuhotep's shrine at Anerti, in his Theban heartland, was even more explicit. It showed a line of 4 kneeling captives, pathetically awaiting their fate of being clubbed to death by the king. First in line, in front of the expected Nubian, Asiatic, and Libyan, was an Egyptian, a representative of the chiefs of the 2 lands. For Egypt's new king, national security began at home. After decades of war and paramilitary activity designed to snuff out all opposition, Mentuhotep felt secure enough to signal his indisputable status as ruler of a reunified Egypt. In typical Egyptian fashion, he did so by adopting a new title, a third version of his Horus name, Semeteui, the one who unites the 2 lands. The factionalism and internal dissent of the time of distress had been consigned to history. Egypt could once again hold its head high as a unified, peaceable nation, ruled by a god-king. The Middle Kingdom had begun. Mentuhotep's lasting memorial epitomizes his determination to reassert the cult of the ruler and project himself as the monarch who restored the tarnished reputation of kingship. In an embayment in the hills of western Thebes, the very same hills that had given his forebears their first military advantage, Mentuhotep ordered work to begin on a lavish funerary monument. As befitted a reunifier, a Renaissance king, it amalgamated old and new ideas. The architecture cleverly combined elements from his forebears' Theban tombs and the Memphite pyramids of the Old Kingdom in a radical and innovative design. The decoration included scenes of battle alongside more traditional images of royalty. Surrounding the royal tomb, burials were prepared for the king's closest advisors and most loyal lieutenants. In a deliberate echo of the great 4th Dynasty court cemetery at Giza, the king's courtiers would surround their monarch in death just as they had in life. But the most poignant component of the entire mortuary complex was a simple, undecorated pit, cut into the rock within sight of the king's vast edifice. This was one of the first parts of Mentuhotep's grand design to be finished, and the pit contained the linen-wrapped bodies of 60 or more men, stacked one on top of another. In life, they had been strong and tall, with an average height of 5 feet, 9.5 inches, and between 30 and 40 years old. Despite their strength, they had all succumbed to the same fate. The injuries on their bodies were mostly arrow wounds and traumas caused by heavy, rough objects falling from a great height. For these men had been soldiers, slain in battle while attacking a fortified town. Scars showed some to have been battle-hardened veterans. Yet what they'd faced in their final test was not hand-to-hand combat but siege warfare. The arrows and missiles raining down on them from the battlements had killed some outright, their tightly curled hair offering scant protection. Other soldiers, wounded but still alive, had been brutally dispatched on the battlefield by having their skulls smashed with clubs. In the heat of battle, bodies had been left for vultures to peck at and tear. Only after the battle had been won, and the town stormed, could the survivors gather up their dead, some already stiff with rigor mortis, strip them of their blood-soaked clothes, scour the bodies clean with sand, and bandage them with linen, making them ready for burial. No attempt had been made to mummify the corpses, and little distinction had been made between different ranks of the dead. The 2 officers had simply been bandaged rather more thoroughly and placed in simple, undecorated coffins. Finally, before burial, the names of the deceased had been written in ink on their linen wrappings, good Theban names, such as Amini, Mentuhotep, and Intefikar, intimate family names such as Sen-Bibi, Bebi's brother, and Sa-Ipu, Ipu's son, and also names such as Sobhotep, Sobanakt, and Seyda-Pibzebek, which suggest an origin far from Thebes, close to the northern cult centers of the crocodile god Sobek. It seems probable that these slain soldiers, given the unique honor of a ceremonial war grave, had been involved in the decisive battle of the Civil War, the final attack on Heracleopolis itself. Some of them may have been local men who nonetheless had supported the Theban army against their own rulers, and so had been especially honored. For King Mentuhotep, conqueror of the Heracleopolitans and reunifier of Egypt, erecting a national cenotaph close to his own tomb was a brilliantly calculated piece of propaganda. It would serve as a Powerful reminder to his contemporaries, and to posterity, of the sacrifices that Thebes had made in the conflict. It would cause Mentuhotep to be forever remembered as a great war leader. And in a foretaste of his successor's mode of rule, it would cement the myth of the king and his band of brothers as the defenders of the nation. The war grave was a harbinger of something else, too. In the brave new world of the Middle Kingdom, a glorious death would, for many, be a substitute for the joys of life. Chapter 7. Paradise Postponed. Something to hope for. Ancient Egypt seems to have been a civilization obsessed with death. From pyramids to mummies, most of the hallmarks of Egyptian culture are connected with funerary customs. Yet, if we look more closely, it was not death itself that lay at the heart of the Egyptians' preoccupations, but rather the means of overcoming it. Pyramids were designed as resurrection machines for Egyptian kings. Mummies were created to provide permanent homes for the undying spirits of the dead. And if mortuary beliefs and grave goods dominate modern views of ancient Egypt, it is only, perhaps, because cemeteries located on the desert edge have survived rather better than towns and villages on the floodplain. Tombs have provided generations of archaeologists with rich and relatively easy pickings, while the excavation of ancient settlements is difficult, laborious, and decidedly less glamorous. Nonetheless, the importance of afterlife beliefs and customs to the ancient Egyptians cannot be waved away as a mere accident of archaeological preservation. Proper preparation for the next world was deemed an essential task if death was not to bring about utter annihilation. Although the hope of an afterlife, and the necessary preparations for it, can be traced back to Egypt's earliest prehistoric cultures, the century or more of political unrest, 2175 to 1970, following the collapse of the Old Kingdom marked a watershed in the long-term development of ancient Egyptian funerary religion. Many of the characteristic features, beliefs, and practices that would survive until the very end of pharaonic civilization were forged in the crucible of social change that accompanied the period of civil war and its aftermath. The weakening of the monarchy affected all sections of the population to a greater or lesser extent. For the vast majority of the population, the illiterate peasantry, the presence or absence of strong government changed little in the pattern of their lives. Long days of toil in the fields, sowing, hoeing, tending, and reaping, were as predictable as the rising sun. But an ineffective national administration could have devastating longer-term effects for ordinary people and their families. A breakdown in central authority left the way open for unscrupulous local officials to exact punitive levels of taxation. Neglect of the irrigation and flood protection systems increased the likelihood of poor harvests and famine. The failure of the state to maintain stockpiles of grain took away the peasant farmer's only insurance policy. Little wonder that eyewitness accounts from the century or so following Pepi II's death speak of hunger stalking the land. For the small, literate elite at the top of the social pyramid, the effects of the political crisis were perhaps less life-threatening but longer-lasting. Senior bureaucrats could be sure of their next meal but not of their next promotion. When the fount of honor dried up, careers built on loyal service to the sovereign were suddenly going nowhere. Influential local families had to look to their own resources to maintain their affluent lifestyles. Shorn of royal patronage and authority, many of them simply decided to go it alone, continuing to govern their communities as before and aggregating to themselves a host of royal prerogatives. As old certainties fell away, so did the rigid distinctions between royal and private provision that had characterized the Pyramid Age. As daily existence grew harder and more uncertain, the need for greater certainty beyond the grave became more pressing. If necessity is the mother of invention, the grim realities of life in post-6th dynasty Egypt created a particularly fertile environment for theological innovation. In more peaceful and prosperous times, as far as we can judge from the mute record of tombs and grave goods, the ruling class had been content to look forward to an afterlife that was essentially a continuation of earthly existence, albeit stripped of the unsavory aspects. The elaborately decorated tomb chapels of the Pyramid Age reflect an era of certainty and an overwhelmingly materialistic view of life after death. The fundamental purpose of tomb decoration, indeed, of the tomb itself, was to provide the deceased with all the material needs of life beyond the grave. Scenes of busy bakers and brewers, potters, carpenters, and metalworkers, of fishermen landing prodigious catches, of offering bearers bringing joints of meat, poultry, fine furniture, and luxury goods, all were designed to ensure a never-ending supply of food, drink, and other provisions, to sustain the tomb owner in an all-too-earthly afterlife. While the king might hope for an afterlife among the stars, at one with the forces of the cosmos, that destiny was barred to even his highest officials. In death as in life, there was one rule for the king and another for his subjects. Such rigid distinctions weakened and eventually gave way as royal authority waned during the long reign of Pepi II and the strife that followed it. Ideas of a transcendent afterlife in the company of the gods spread through the general population, transforming funerary practices and the wider culture. Earthly success and being well remembered after death were no longer enough. The hope of something better in the next world, of transfiguration and transformation, became paramount. Notions of what lay on the other side of death were elaborated, codified, and combined in ever more inventive formulations. In the process, the ancient Egyptians devised the key concepts of original sin, an underworld rife with dangers and demons, a final judgment before the great God, and the promise of a glorious resurrection. These concepts would echo through later civilizations and ultimately shape the Judeo-Christian tradition. An afterlife for all. Back in the days of the great pyramid builders, resurrection in any meaningful sense was reserved for the king and depended upon him achieving divine status, even if, in the case of Yunus, it meant literally consuming the gods themselves. Only the king, as earthly incarnation of the sky god Horus and son of the sun, possessed sufficient influence, knowledge, and rank to gain access to the celestial realm. The first cracks in this forbidding edifice of royal prerogative appeared in the reign of Pepi II. Ironically, the erosion of the monarch's unique privilege began inside the royal family itself. Pepi's half-sister, Nath, had her own tiny pyramid inscribed with texts drawn from the collection of spells that had hitherto been the preserve of the sovereign. The ripples from this minor break with tradition soon spread out across a wider section of Egyptian society. In the remote Dakhla oasis, far enough from the court for breaches in protocol to go unnoticed, the Governor Medunfer was laid to rest surrounded by protective funerary spells culled from the pyramid texts. A generation later, another official went even further, decorating the walls of his burial chamber with the very anthology used in the Pyramid of Yunus. Before long, even minor administrators in the provinces were having their wooden coffins inscribed with extracts from the pyramid texts and new compositions. Just how Pepi II's successors responded to this profound social and religious change is difficult to say. With the exception of King Ibi's tiny pyramid at Saqqara, the tombs of the 8th dynasty and of the Heracleopolitan rulers remain undiscovered. In all probability, these monuments incorporated new ways of distinguishing their royal owners from the common people. Yet the adoption of royal texts and images by private citizens represented a seismic shift in the underlying structure of ancient Egyptian civilization. A stark division that had existed between the king and his subjects since the dawn of history had been demolished, once and for all. Now every Egyptian could hope to attain divinity in the afterlife, to spend eternity in the company of the gods. At the same time, this blurring of the distinction between royal and private served, ironically, to underline the unique position of the king. Pictures of royal regalia painted inside private coffins gave their owners the wherewithal to achieve divine status and hence resurrection after death, but only by aping the king. At a time of political fragmentation and civil war, it may have been reassuring for people to feel that divine kingship was alive and well, and a force for good in their ultimate fate. The so-called democratization of the afterlife was anything but democratic, and in this respect was a characteristically ancient Egyptian transformation. Just as profound as the opening up of the afterlife was the change in how the afterlife was envisaged. Many of the pyramid texts had stressed the age-old belief in the king's journey to the stars and his destiny among the indestructibles, but some of the spells had also introduced a newer concept, the dead king's association with Osiris. This ancient earth god was both revered and feared as ruler of the underworld, but his victory over the decay of death offered the promise of resurrection for the king and, later, for the common people, too. Eternal life could be sought just as well in the nourishment of the earth as in the unchanging rhythm of the universe. Osiris became the champion of the dead, and his underworld kingdom their destination of choice. His chthonic realm at first joined, then ultimately displaced, a celestial setting for the Egyptians' afterlife journey. The universal wish to be identified after death with Osiris led to important, visible changes in burial customs. From the very beginnings of mummification, its aim had been to preserve the body of the deceased in as recognizable a form as possible. By wrapping the individual limbs, fingers, and toes separately, and molding the features of the face in linen bandages, a more or less lifelike appearance could be achieved. Now that the deceased wished to be transmogrified into Osiris, the preservation of human characteristics was no longer necessary. Instead, the corpse was swathed from head to toe in a single cocoon of bandages, giving it the classic form of a mummy. With this outward appearance of transfiguration being sufficient to conjure the appropriate associations, even the process of mummification could be neglected. Corners were regularly cut, stages omitted, so that underneath the bandages many Middle Kingdom mummies are very poorly preserved. Sometimes the brain was left inside the skull or the organs inside the body, leading to putrefaction. Failure to dry the body sufficiently, or economies in the use of expensive unguents, caused rapid deterioration of the soft tissues. But now that religious concerns had largely replaced material needs at the heart of funerary beliefs, a functioning body was of lesser concern than a passport to the underworld. Being wrapped up to look like Osiris was a good start. The undiscovered country, overcoming death, achieving a successful resurrection, and navigating the many dangers that lurked in the underworld required powerful magic, and it was here that texts and images came into their own. In the royal and private tombs of the Old Kingdom, the necessary spells and pictures had been carved or painted on the walls of the burial chamber and tomb chapel. But as traditions of craftsmanship slowly withered after Pepi II's death, with the decline of the royal workshops, so tomb decoration became increasingly rare. Experienced artists were simply no longer available. Three-dimensional wooden models replaced the painted scenes of craftsmen at work. For the modern scholar, the miniature yet intricate models of bakeries, breweries, slaughterhouses, and weavers' workshops are a gold mine for reconstructing ancient technologies. For the Egyptians, they were simply a poor man's substitute for fine paintings in an era of cultural impoverishment. In the absence of decorated tombs, the coffin itself became both a focus for decoration and a canvas for the magical formulae, called, appropriately, coffin texts, to assist the deceased in the afterlife. To assist the owner's resurrection, the mummified body was laid on its side, facing east, toward the rising sun. Sunrise, unique among natural phenomena, offered the daily promise of rebirth after the darkness of the preceding night. A pair of magical eyes, painted on the eastern face of the coffin and carefully aligned with the mummy's face, allowed the deceased to look out at the sunrise toward the land of the living. These eyes deliberately recalled the face markings of a falcon, giving the deceased the all-seeing power of Horus. By means of this interlocking and overlapping symbolism, the dead person was identified with Osiris, god of the underworld, and assisted by Ra and Horus, the two most powerful celestial deities. And so, safe inside the coffin, reborn and revivified by the sun's rays, the transfigured mummy set out on its afterlife journey. Or, rather, journeys. In typical Egyptian fashion, two different paths to paradise were imagined. These were described in the Book of Two Ways, the earliest of the ancient Egyptian afterlife books. This particular collection of coffin texts expresses two contrasting destinies, revealing two competing strands of belief that had already been articulated in the Old Kingdom pyramid texts. A celestial afterlife with the sun god was still very much an option, and was now accessible to all. To participate in this version of paradise, the soul of the deceased, imagined as a human-headed bird, would fly out of the coffin and up from the tomb into the heavens. Each night, as the sun sank into the underworld, the soul would return again to the mummy for safety. This concept of the soul, or Ba, illustrates perfectly the ancient Egyptians' fondness and talent for theological elaboration. Regarded as an individual's personality, the Ba existed as a kind of alter ego during life, but came into its own after death, allowing the deceased to take part in the solar cycle. However, in order to be reborn each morning, it had to be reunited with Osiris, in the form of the mummified body, each night. The counterpart of the Ba was the Ka, the eternal spirit that required the sustenance of food and drink to survive, and through which the dead person could follow the alternative path, the journey through the underworld to the abode of Osiris. From the land of life, the deceased set out on an epic voyage toward his ultimate destination, the field of offering. This mythical land, the Egyptians believed, was located close to the eastern horizon, the place of sunrise. While part of the underworld, it nevertheless held the promise of rebirth. As the Ka traveled from west to east, it followed the nightly progress of the sun through the realm of darkness and shared in its daily renewal. But accomplishing the journey safely was no easy task. According to the coffin texts, the way was full of obstacles and fraught with dangers. Gates to enter, waterways to cross, demons to placate, esoteric knowledge to master. In one example, the dead had to learn the various parts of a ship in order to win a place on the bark of the sun god. Spells provided the magical means for overcoming such hurdles. And some coffins were even decorated, on the inside, for the convenience of the deceased, with detailed maps of the underworld, charting the various seas, islands, watercourses, and settlements along the way to the field of offering. The lurid descriptions of what lay between death and salvation conjure up a Hieronymus Bosch vision of hell, reflecting the universal horror of death and the desperate wish for eternal life. The ancient Egyptians' fears ranged from the all too familiar afflictions of thirst and starvation to the peculiar horror of an upside-down world in which they would have to walk on their heads, drink urine, and eat excrement. The coffin texts show the human imagination at its most fevered. The ultimate destination, however, was worth all the trials and tribulations. The Egyptians imagined the domain of Osiris as the Elysian Fields, a landscape of lush, well-watered farmland yielding record harvests, of orchards and gardens bringing forth abundant produce, of peace and plenty for all eternity. Having arrived at journey's end, the deceased could look forward to an afterlife full of satisfaction. It was an afterlife to die for. Presiding over this agricultural idol was the god Osiris, the exemplar of resurrection and the surest source of eternal life. By battling against the odds to join Osiris, the deceased had ensured not only his own rebirth but also the continued renewal of the god. In mythological terms, the deceased had acted as Horus for his father, Osiris, and Osiris had rewarded him appropriately. It is no accident that this concept of the afterlife reflects a world in which inheritance and succession are of central importance. The coffin texts were composed in a milieu of powerful regional governors, and simply reflected the governor's particular concerns. The ancient Egyptians, like all peoples, projected their daily experiences onto their religious beliefs. Osiris triumphant. The rise of Osiris from obscure beginnings to universal god of the dead lay at the heart of the new religious order. As he became venerated throughout the length and breadth of Egypt, Osiris eclipsed a host of other, more ancient funerary deities, assimilating their attributes and usurping their temples. The townspeople of Jeddu, in the central delta, had worshipped their local god, Enjedi, for centuries, believing him to have been an earthly ruler miraculously resurrected after death. As the cult of Osiris spread outward from the royal residence, it absorbed these complementary beliefs, and Jeddu eventually became the main center of Osiris worship in Lower Egypt. Enjedi all but disappeared as a separate deity, becoming a distant folk memory. A similar process took place in the south of the country, at Abju. Here, the local people worshipped a funerary god in the form of a jackal, an animal often seen prowling over the desert burial grounds. Kenchimentu, foremost of the Westerners, was the guardian of the West, the land of the dead, and lord of the necropolis. The cult of Osiris soon laid claim to these attributes as well. By the 11th dynasty, circa 2000, inscriptions in the temple at Abju were already speaking of a hybrid god, Osiris Kenchimentu. A few generations later and foremost of the Westerners was regarded merely as an epithet of Osiris. The god's triumph was total. In the case of Abju, the additional presence of early royal tombs gave the site a special sanctity and air of antiquity. It must have seemed preordained that the archetypal resurrected ruler, Osiris, should have his main place of worship in the place where kings had been buried since the dawn of history. So, from the period of civil war onward, Abju became the principal center of the Osiris cult and one of the most important holy places in all Egypt. The desecration of its sacred sites during the bitter war between the Heracleopolitan and Theban dynasties was a cause of shame to the northern kings, and their ultimate defeat came to be seen as divine retribution for such a heinous act of sacrilege. The victor in the civil war, King Mentuhotep II, lost no time in demonstrating his devout credentials by beautifying the shrine of Osiris Kenchimentu. Under Mentuhotep's successors, the temple received further royal patronage. Abju was transformed into a focus for national pilgrimage and a stage for elaborate ceremonies celebrating the god's resurrection. The mysteries of Osiris were performed annually in the presence of a great crowd of spectators from all over Egypt. At the heart of the rites was a reenactment of the god's kingship, death, and resurrection. These three strands of the Osiris myth were reflected in three separate processions. First, the cult image of the god appeared, to signify his status as a living ruler. One of the temple priests, or, on occasions, a visiting dignitary acting as the king's personal representative, took the role of the jackal god Wepwa, the opener of the ways, walking at the front of the procession as the herald of Osiris. The second and central element in the drama recalled the god's death and funeral. A great following escorted the cult image, enclosed in a special bark shrine, as it was borne on the shoulders of priests from the temple to the royal necropolis of the First Dynasty. En route, ritualized attacks on the bark shrine were staged to represent the struggle between good and evil. The attackers were repulsed by other participants, taking the role of the god's defenders. For all its sacred imagery, this mock battle could at times turn nasty, religious fervor tipping over into violence and resulting in serious injuries. Pious zeal and inflamed passion are ancient bedfellows. The third and final act of the mysteries was Osiris's rebirth and triumphant return to his temple. His cult image was taken back to the sanctuary, purified, and adorned. The ceremonies over, the crowds dispersed and normality returned to Abju for another year. So powerful was the symbolism of the Osiris mysteries that participation, whether in person or vicariously, became a lifetime goal. For ancient Egyptians, their equivalent of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem or Mecca. For most of the population, long-distance travel within Egypt was a practical impossibility. Even if they could afford the trip, leaving their land unworked for a week or more risked crop failure and disaster. Bureaucrats working in the administration were rather better off in this regard, but still needed official permission to leave their posts and go up or downstream to Abju. The best option for most people was attendance by proxy. If they could have a cenotaph or stela, anything with their name on it, set up along the route of the great following, then they, too, could benefit from the god's resurrective power as he passed by. As a result, the sacred way leading from the Temple of Osiris became the favored location for memorials great and small. Those with plentiful resources might commission statues of themselves, set within miniature chapels. The less affluent had to make do with a crude stone slab, or merely a mention on someone else's monument. Rich or poor, every devout Egyptian longed for a piece of the action. Within a few generations, the terrace of the great god was packed with memorials 5 or 6 deep. They occupied every available inch along both sides of the route, threatening to encroach on the sacred way itself. For those who could not afford even the humblest presents at Abju, there were always the Osiris festivals celebrated throughout the provinces, not as potent, nor as prestigious, but better than nothing. By recalling and celebrating the god's resurrection in their local cemeteries, the priests and people hoped that some of his magic would rub off on the poor souls interred nearby, affording them, too, the promise of eternal life. From prehistoric times, Egyptian towns and villages had played host to a plethora of different beliefs, deities, and styles of worship, reflected in the diversity of local shrines and the diversity of the votive objects deposited in them. Now, for perhaps the first time in its history, Egypt had something approaching a national religion. As Osiris worship reached its zenith at the height of the Middle Kingdom, the coffin texts fell rapidly out of fashion. They were replaced by a whole host of esoteric magical objects that evidently had the same function. These objects enabled the deceased to be resurrected as Osiris, to reach the field of offering, and to journey with Ra in his solar bark. Some of these new objects were lifted directly from daily life but given an afterlife function. Ivory wands inscribed with the images of demons and protective deities were routinely used in Egyptian households to create a protected zone around women in childbirth, to ward off evil spirits that might harm the mother or baby. 2. The Egyptians' way of thinking, it seemed perfectly natural to bury such an object in the tomb. The reborn was just as vulnerable as the newborn, and needed equal protection. In a similar vein, fertility figurines, used in a household setting to promote the successful delivery and rearing of children, found a corresponding role in a funerary setting, assisting rebirth and regeneration. Other types of magical objects, however, were manufactured specifically for the tomb. Without known parallels from daily life, they often defy easy explanation. Two of the most characteristic, yet enigmatic, are small models of hedgehogs and hippopotami made from faience, more accurately, glazed composition, a blue glazed glassy material. Because these are uninscribed, and without accompanying texts, it is impossible to deduce their original symbolism, although several different theories can be proposed. This is in keeping with the multi-layered nature of ancient Egyptian theology, whereby multiple explanations for a single phenomenon, even if apparently contradictory, were believed to add to the weight of evidence in favor and to confer added numinousness. Hedgehogs were known to burrow underground, and may therefore have been thought of as intermediaries between the land of the living and the underworld, ideal companions for the afterlife journey. Hedgehogs also roll themselves into balls when threatened, taking on the shape of the sun disk in the process. It is possible they were believed to offer the deceased symbolic protection and a closer relationship with the sun god. Perhaps, as denizens of the semi-arid desert margins. Hedgehogs and similar creatures, model jerboas, were also popular, symbolize the triumph of life over the barrenness of death, a highly appropriate metaphor for the tomb. Hippos, on the other hand, were aquatic creatures, inhabitants of the watery world that led to the field of offering. They were known to be fierce and aggressive, expert at warding off potential attackers. A hippopotamus goddess was also the deity most closely associated with pregnant women and childbirth. The web of potential connotations is extensive, reflecting the richness and variety of ancient Egyptian religious thought. Indeed, such complexity, often contradictory to the modern logical mind, merely served, in the Egyptians' eyes, to underline the mystery and unknowability of the divine. At about the time that hedgehogs and hippos were making their appearance among grave goods, another afterlife accessory arrived on the scene, a curious little object that encapsulates the Egyptians' genius for invention and their intensely practical attitude toward problem solving. Thanks to its rapid rise in popularity, the object in question is now ubiquitous in museum collections the world over, the funerary figurine. The ancient Egyptian term was shapti, perhaps derived from the word for stick and reflecting the rudimentary modeling of the earliest examples. But this was no ordinary stick figure. It had a far more important, magical purpose. Its origins lie in the period of civil war, and, as ideas go, it was startlingly simple. Without royal workshops full of well-trained craftsmen, or sculptors and painters to decorate their tombs, the Egyptians faced a serious dilemma. If their mummified body were destroyed, how would the Ka be sustained, and whence would the Ba return each night after its celestial wanderings? A substitute body was the answer, and its early form was exceptionally crude, a small stick-like figure made from mud or wax, perhaps wrapped in a few shreds of linen to represent mummy bandages, and supplied with its own miniature coffin fashioned from some scraps of wood. The quality of the finished product hardly mattered. Once in the tomb, magic would put right any deficiencies in the workmanship. So began the tradition of funerary figurines, an emergency measure in an age of unrest and uncertainty. But with the reunification of Egypt under King Mentuhotep and the subsequent flowering of court culture in the Middle Kingdom, royal workshops returned, and finely crafted statues and painted tombs became available, at least to the elite, once more. Yet the funerary figurine did not disappear. It came to represent something different but just as useful, a servant to assist the deceased for all eternity. With an Osirian view of the afterlife now dominant, the Shapti really came into its own. For there was one major drawback to spending an eternity in the field of offering. While it might be an agricultural idol, with well-watered fields yielding abundant crops, every Egyptian knew all too well that agriculture, even in such ideal conditions, involved hard physical labor. Particularly arduous and backbreaking was the annual repair of dikes, ditches, and waterways following the inundation, essential to restoring the irrigation network to full working order. Every able-bodied individual was pressed into service for this vital communal task, excavating and carrying baskets of sand and silt from field to field, all in the hot, humid, mosquito-infested conditions that followed the retreat of the floodwaters. Would this be an inescapable chore in the afterlife, too? Surely there was some way of avoiding such unpleasantness for all eternity. The solution was a stroke of genius. The little stick figure that had previously substituted as a body for the deceased retained its basic function as a stand-in, but now, instead of providing a home for the Ka and Ba, it would answer the call to work on behalf of its owner. Servant figurines from the late Middle Kingdom were duly equipped with miniature agricultural implements, such as hoes and baskets, and just in case they should forget, a brief hieroglyphic text, carved on their body, reminded them of their principal duty. When it came to life after death, a Shapti was the perfect insurance policy. Truth will out. One final, crucial aspect of the afterlife adventure also made its first appearance in the years following the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Like the coffin texts, magical objects, and servant figurines, the concept of a last judgment reflected the mixture of hope and fear that beset the ancient Egyptians in their musings about life after death. Perhaps more than any other feature of Egyptian religion, the idea of a final, inevitable reckoning before a divine judge had a profound and lasting impact on the subsequent development of pharaonic beliefs. Unlike hedgehogs, hippos, and Shaptis, the Last Judgment was picked up by other religious traditions of the Near East as well, notably Christianity. The imaginary geography of the Book of Two Ways began with the island of fire, where the wicked were consumed in flames but the good were provided with refreshing water for their arduous journey through the underworld. The concept of trial by fire is an ancient one. But this relatively simplistic notion of judgment, whereby the unrighteous dead were separated from the righteous by means of a single, swift test, was itself to be refined in the flames of social change. Once again, the shattered illusions that accompanied the breakup of the Egyptian state proved a fertile breeding ground for new ideas. In troubled times, death came to be seen not as a mere transition to another dimension of creation but as a discontinuity, a break that might prove terminal. Whether an individual achieved rebirth as a divine being or suffered a second death depended on his or her own actions during life. The literary text known as the Instruction for King Merakara, purportedly composed by a Heracleopolitan king, summed up this new belief. In this scheme of things, virtue was no longer enough, it had to be accompanied by freedom from vice. In inscriptions of the period, the boastfulness and bombast typical of Old Kingdom autobiographies are joined for the first time by notes of doubt and defensiveness. A man might enumerate his many qualities and achievements but also take pains to state I never spoke a falsehood against any living person. For the negative confession, a declaration not to have committed a prescribed list of wrongful acts, became an essential component of the judgment process. Vindication before the divine tribunal required more, however, than a mere denial of wrongdoing. It involved a fundamental assessment of a person's true worth, a weighing of their good and bad deeds in order to arrive at a balanced judgment of their character. Only those who passed this calculation of differences were deemed fit to join Osiris and live forever. On his stela from Abju, the 11th dynasty general, Intef confidently proclaims that his voice is true in the calculation of differences. In other words, he has been justified and found worthy of resurrection as a transfigured spirit. From such tentative beginnings, the concept of judgment rapidly acquired a central place in Egyptian funerary religion, to the extent that the term true of voice became the most common euphemism for deceased. In a society as obsessed with bureaucracy and accountancy as ancient Egypt was, it is perhaps not surprising that theologians imagine the weighing of a person's worth taking place on a giant set of goldsmith's scales. The accuracy of the balance perfectly expressed the unerring judgment of the divine tribunal. A spell from the coffin text describes the scales as that balance of Ra on which Ma'at is lifted up, 5 indicating that the judgment is authorized by Ra himself, God of the sun and of creation, and that the deeds of the deceased are to be weighed against Ma'at, the goddess of truth. In this ultimate assessment, there was no room for cheating. The outcome of the judgment process was visualized as all the deceased being separated into groups, the justified and the unjust, numbering the dead and counting the blessed spirits. 6. The differing fates of the two groups were crystal clear. With eternal survival at stake in the Last Judgment, the fevered Egyptian imagination swung into action. Conceiving further hurdles, hand in hand with the means of overcoming them, seems to have given the ancient Egyptians the courage to face the uncertainties of death. In the case of judgment before the tribunal, the greatest danger was that one's own heart, seat of the intellect, fount of emotion, and storehouse of memories, might decide to bear false witness and so tip the balance against a favorable verdict. To counter this awful risk, powerful magic was required. Somehow, the heart had to be prevented from blurting out untruths, or hidden truths, that might seal its owner's fate. The ingenious solution was a new type of amulet, first introduced into burials in the late Middle Kingdom. It took the familiar shape of a scarab beetle, a potent symbol of rebirth, because young beetles hatch from a ball of dung, emblematic of death and decay. But unlike other scarab amulets, this one had a human head and was engraved with a protective spell, addressed to the heart. After the body had undergone mummification, the heart scarab was placed over the heart, with clear instructions as to how the organ should behave at the moment of truth. In time the heart itself came to stand for the deceased and his deeds, and the pictorial representation of the weighing of the heart against the feather of truth became an essential image on funerary papyri, an encapsulation of the final judgment. It remains one of the most instantly recognizable, characteristic, and evocative scenes from the entire repertoire of ancient Egyptian art. And the concept of a dreadful day of judgment, when the secrets of all hearts shall be disclosed, is still with us, 4,000 years later. Chapter 8. The Face of Tyranny. Brave New World. Victor in the civil war and reunifier of the two lands, King Mentuhotep was fated by later generations of Egyptians as a great founder figure, on a par with Menes, the mythical first king of the first dynasty. Yet fate decreed that Mentuhotep's descendants did not long enjoy his hard-won spoils. After the brief and unspectacular reigns of two more Mentuhoteps, the royal line of the Theban 11th dynasty, of Intef II and Mentuhotep, faltered. In its place, a new family rose to power, two claimed the throne and the prize of kingship. The 12th dynasty, 1938 to 1755, was the most stable line of kings ever to rule over ancient Egypt. For a period of 180 years, 8 monarchs, representing 7 generations of a single family, governed the two lands. Under their firm control, Egypt prospered materially and culturally. It was the golden age of ancient Egyptian literature, when many of the classics were composed. Craftsmanship reached new heights, with craftsmen creating the most exquisite jewelry to survive from the ancient world. Egypt's reach and influence were extended more widely than ever before, and in new directions, embracing the Aegean, Cyprus, and Anatolia as well as the Red Sea coast and Nubia. And, above all, the Nile Valley and Delta themselves were reordered into a unified, well-regulated, and efficient country, a re-centralized state to banish the recent divisions of civil war. This description of the 12th dynasty is factually accurate. Yet it is misleading in one crucial respect: it signally fails to capture the prevailing mood of the period. Literary works focus on uncomfortable themes such as world weariness, dispute between a man and his soul, national upheaval, the admonitions of power, and regicide. The instruction of Amenemhat I for his son. The glowing picture of Middle Kingdom civilization that finds favor in some histories of ancient Egypt is jarringly at odds both with writings from that time and with the evidence for internal politics and government. From its very inception, the 12th dynasty set out to change the way Egypt was ruled and the way society was organized. It was a utopian vision, or dystopian, depending on your standpoint, of absolute order, underpinned by a rigid bureaucratic framework and by the suppression of all dissent. In the business of government, the kings of the 12th dynasty displayed a ruthless streak, entirely in keeping with the policies of their old kingdom forebears. In their determination to establish rock-solid internal security, they outdid all their predecessors, deploying sophisticated propaganda alongside brute force, subtle persuasion backed up by terror tactics. Beneath the outward show of glittering high culture, darker forces were at work. The prevailing tone of 12th dynasty rule was established at its outset. Given that the founder of the new royal line was a commoner by birth, it is scarcely surprising that the official record does not document the manner of his accession. But there are enough hints to suggest the likely course of events. The last king of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep IV, 1948 to 1938, was the namesake of the great reunifier, but seems entirely to have lacked his leadership qualities. He had inherited his forebears' strongly Theban outlook, but not his wider ambitions. Provincial by nature as well as by background, he left no major monuments. The principal accomplishment of his short reign was to dispatch a quarrying expedition to the Black Mountains of the Wadi Hammamat, to bring back a block of stone for the royal sarcophagus. Details of the expedition were recorded in 4 inscriptions, cut into the quarry face. Although they pay due reverence to the king as the mission's sponsor, and wish him, insincerely, 1. imagines, millions of jubilees, they give the credit for the expedition's success to its actual leader, and the man behind the inscriptions, the member of the elite, high official, overseer of the city, vizier, overseer of officials, lord of judgment, overseer of everything in this entire land, the vizier Amenemhat. 1. The next time we encounter a man named Amenemhat in high office, he is lord of the two lands and son of Ra, the founder of the 12th dynasty. Although the transition from king's right-hand man to monarch is not explicitly attested, there can be little doubt that Amenemhat I took full advantage of his unrivaled position at court to seize the throne when it fell vacant, or when the opportunity arose. There are strong indications that the new dynasty came to power in lawless times, by means of a coup d'état rather than by peaceful succession. A remarkable series of inscriptions in another stone quarry, at Hatnub in Middle Egypt, give a vivid account of struggles within Egypt during Amenemhat I's reign, 1938 to 1908. Written during the tenure of the local governor Neri, the texts are unusually dated to his years of office, not those of the reigning king. This extraordinary Assumption of the kingly prerogative by a mere provincial official. Suggests all was not well with the age-old model of royal government. The inscriptions themselves tell of rebellion, famine, plunder, invading armies, and civil strife. And at the heart of the unrest was the palace itself. I rescued my town on the day of fighting from the sickening terror of the royal house. 2. There is no more chilling reference to tyrannical monarchy in all of Egyptian history. Amenemhat I had chosen as Horus. Name well. He who pacifies the heart of the two lands had a deliberately aggressive undertone, and the long hand of royal pacification reached even beyond the Nile Valley, into the vast expanses of the Sahara. An experienced desert huntsman and overseer of the western desert named K was called upon to lead a counterinsurgency operation, to seek out and round up fugitives from the new regime. On K's funerary stela are the words, I reached the western oasis, I investigated all its tracks, I brought back the fugitives I found there. 3. Under 12th dynasty rule, there would be no hiding place for rebels. Yet opposition was not so easily crushed. The king seems to have faced attack from several quarters, including internal dissent along Egypt's two banks. A funerary stela from the time refers to a naval campaign along the Nile and a dawn raid against a landing stage. While the contemporary inscription of the regional governor Khnumhotep I, in his tomb at Beni Hassan, alludes to the same mission. I sailed with His Majesty to the south in 20 cedar ships. Then he returned, kissing the earth, for joy, because he had driven him from the two banks. 4. The foe is deliberately left unnamed. Inscribing his name in sacred hieroglyphs would have given him the possibility of eternal life, but he was clearly a homegrown rebel, perhaps even the last king of the 11th dynasty or one of his adherents. Moreover, the reliefs in Khnumhotep's tomb, and the tombs of his immediate successors, show Egyptians attacking fellow Egyptians in full scale. Urban warfare, unprecedented scenes in deeply unsettled times. Eventually, the king's forces triumphed, and Amenemhat I lost no time in appointing his loyal lieutenants to key posts in the administration. Khnumhotep was appointed mayor of the regional capital of Menat Khufu. Elsewhere in Middle Egypt, nomarchs whose families had served under the 11th dynasty were summarily dismissed, to be replaced by trusted loyalists who owed everything to the current regime. Egypt's new master was tightening his grip on the levers of government. Renaissance ruler. Bolstered by his success in repressing internal dissent, the king set about restoring the status of the monarchy. Since time immemorial, the two most important roles of the sovereign had been to uphold order and to satisfy the gods. Having done the first, it was time for the second. Amenemhat I duly ordered construction to begin on a great temple to his patron deity, the Theban god Amun. After all, Amenemhat meant Amun is at the forefront. So nothing less than the grandest temple in the land would suffice. Before the 12th dynasty, Egyptian temples had been very modest affairs, small, often irregular constructions of mud brick, with only a sparing use of stone for doorways, thresholds, and the like. The most imposing buildings in Egypt were not the temples of deities but the pyramids of kings. Amenemhat changed all that, inaugurating the tradition of monumental edifices dedicated to the major gods and goddesses. Little remains of the Middle Kingdom. Temple of Amun at Ipizit, modern Karnak, it was unceremoniously swept away by later royal builders, but it must have dominated the adjoining city, making a powerful statement of royal power. The complex measured more than 330 feet long by 214 feet broad and was enclosed by two thick perimeter walls. Inside stood the sanctuary, fronted by a magnificent stone terrace, and surrounded by a maze of corridors and storerooms. By comparison with the trifling provincial temples of the Old Kingdom, it was staggering in its scale. It was also a harbinger of things to come. Amenemhat I and his successors would show an insatiable appetite for state-planned construction, the architectural manifestation of their new order. A penchant for grand architectural statements was characteristically Egyptian, but Amenemhat took it to new heights, with a project that dwarfed even his temple to Amun. Toward the middle of his reign, the King gave the order to commence construction of nothing less than a new capital city. A narrow focus on Thebes and its hinterland had been a fatal weakness of the 11th dynasty, and Amenemhat was not about to make the same mistake. The only practical solution for governing a vast realm like Egypt was to place the capital at its geographical center, and that is exactly where the new dynastic city would be built. The location was at the very junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, the balance of the two lands. But, to signify his iron will, the king chose a starker name for the city, Amenemhat-Ijta'i. Amenemhat seizes the two lands. It was a bald assertion of his modus operandi, the means by which he had gained the throne, and the way in which he intended to govern. To mark the inauguration of his new capital, the king also adopted a new Horus name. As always, the choice reflected the monarch's personal agenda. Out went references to pacifying the heart of the two lands, that had largely been achieved, and Ijta'i now stood as concrete proof. Instead, the king proclaimed himself the instigator of a thoroughgoing renaissance. Under Amenemhat, Egypt would be reborn, its civilization rejuvenated, and its monarchy re-established. If the aim was to bring back the cultural zenith of the Pyramid Age, a good way to start was by building an appropriately grand royal tomb. So, for the first time in 2 centuries, the order went out from the royal palace to the architects, masons, and craftsmen of Egypt. The king required a pyramid. Furthermore, it had to be on the same scale as the pyramids of the late Old Kingdom. Taking its dimensions from the royal monuments of the 6th dynasty, Amenemhat I's pyramid started to rise on the desert plateau close to his new capital city. Nothing like it had been seen for 300 years. To give it added legitimacy and potency, the king ordered that blocks from the greatest of all such monuments, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, at Giza, be transported to Ijta'i and incorporated into the core of his own pyramid. Demolishing and cannibalizing the monument of an illustrious predecessor might appear sacrilegious, but it was an essential part of the Renaissance plan. His successors of the 12th dynasty would all follow his lead and build their own pyramids. Well might Amenemhat boast, kingship has become again what it was in the past. 5 Having quelled internal rebellion, honored the gods, and begun a pyramid, Amenemhat I might have been tempted to think that the rebirth of Egyptian civilization was assured. However, foreign incursions from Palestine and Nubia during the First Intermediate period had taught Egypt a hard lesson. Its neighbors to the north and south had greedy eyes for the Nile Valley's fertile pastures. Maintaining the country's prosperity required active defense of its territorial integrity. Alive to the threat, the king directed his zeal toward securing the nation's borders. His policy would set the scene for the following century and a half. Egypt would be turned into a fortress. The country's northeastern frontier, along the margins of the delta, presented a particular challenge. The marshy terrain, crisscrossed by river branches and canals, made it difficult, if not impossible, to establish a fixed border, or to maintain watertight control over immigration from the impoverished lands of Palestine beyond. Amenemhat's response was to order the construction of a series of fortified bases, strung out along the frontier zone, within signaling distance of each other. Regular patrols were dispatched from each garrison to monitor traffic across the border. In this way, these walls of the ruler might hope to prevent major incursions and could provide intelligence on any unusual movements. The emphasis on surveillance as a means of control was characteristic of the 12th dynasty's security policy. Egypt's southern flank, its border with Nubia, posed a different threat and required a different solution. Ever since the expeditions of Harkhuf in the 6th dynasty, it had been clear that the peoples of Wawat, Lower Nubia, closest to the Egyptian border, were reasserting their autonomy and forming states of their own, in direct defiance of Egyptian hegemony. With Egypt racked by internal strife and civil war following the collapse of the Old Kingdom, this process merely accelerated. The reliance of the Theban army on Nubian mercenaries may have bolstered still further the Nubians' own sense of nationhood. By the end of the 11th dynasty, the situation could scarcely have been worse for the Egyptian king. Not only had he lost control over most of Wawat, but his very prestige was being openly challenged by local Nubian rulers who were using Egyptian royal titles. One such, styling himself the Horus Ankhnumra, the king Wajgara, the son of Ra Sagersini, even referred to the Egyptians as the enemies, turning the established rhetoric on its head. Another, with the effrontery to call himself King Intef after the great Theban war leaders of the early 11th dynasty, was confident enough to have a series of 15 inscriptions cut into rocks at prominent locations throughout his territory. Such blatant insults to the might of Egypt could not be tolerated. A large number of inscriptions carved in the same region by Egyptian expeditions bear witness to a frenzy of activity from the early years of Amenemhat I's reign. Even as he was bearing down on his opponents within Egypt, it appears his spies were at work in Lower Nubia, carrying out maneuvers and gathering intelligence, in preparation for a full-scale assault. After 2 decades of preparations, during which order was restored at home, Egyptian forces regained control of the key site of Buin, at the foot of the Second Nile Cataract, and started to turn it into a fortified base, to use as a springboard for military campaigns. By Amenemhat I's 29th year on the throne, everything was ready. An expeditionary force led by his trusted vizier and Tefekar arrived from Egypt to overthrow Wawat. In his determination to snuff out any vestige of Nubian independence and to impose absolute Egyptian control over the wayward province, the king's henchmen showed no mercy to the local inhabitants, boasting Amenemhat's scorched earth policy was designed not merely to punish Wawat but to send a powerful message to any other would-be insurgents. As for the unfortunate Nubians who watched from the riverbank as their land was devastated and their houses went up in flames, their fate was sealed. Before laying waste to Wawat, Intefekar recorded that he was busy building this compound. The enclosure in question was a holding area. The ancient Egyptians might have preferred the modern euphemism reception center, for people conscripted for state labor. A life of servitude lay in store for the conquered inhabitants of Wawat. They and their descendants would toil to exploit the resources of their homeland for its new Egyptian masters. Mightier than the sword uneasy lies the head that wears a crown, the more so when that crown has been won by force rather than inherited by lawful succession. Amenemhat I, founder of a new dynasty and self-proclaimed Renaissance king, was acutely conscious of his non-royal origins and of the lingering resentment felt toward his rule in parts of Egypt, never mind in conquered Nubia. Anxious, above all, to consolidate his family's grip on power and ensure a smooth succession, Amenemhat took the highly unusual, if not unprecedented, step of having his son and heir crowned king while he himself still reigned. Prince Senusret became co-regent at the end of Amenemhat's second decade on the throne, circa 1918, and the two kings ruled jointly for a further decade. A few monuments bear joint dates, although for the most part Amenemhat seems to have been content for formal inscriptions to be dated to his son's reign. The institution of co-regency became a feature of royal succession in the 12th dynasty. It served its primary purpose of excluding any rival claimants to the throne until, after a further century and a half, the dynasty itself ran out of steam. But even this ultimate contingency could not protect Amenemhat I from his regime's many enemies. He had lived by the sword and he would perish in the same manner. A remarkable and unique text composed after his death has the dead king, like old Hamlet, recalling the manner of his assassination to his son and successor. Thus did the first tyrant of the 12th dynasty meet his fate. But with a co-regent already on the throne, the desperate assassins had made a terrible miscalculation. In place of the father, the son assumed full power and lost no time in continuing the same policies, but with an added twist. Where overt oppression had failed, subtler methods would be deployed to win the battle for hearts and minds. Commissioning a work of literature on the theme of his father's regicide was a bold step for Senusret I. It threatened the very ideology of divine kingship and broke a powerful taboo against discussing crises in public. But Senusret and his advisors were playing a clever game. They realized there was more to gain by publicizing the murder than by trying to hush it up. Back in the days of the Civil War, provincial leaders such as Angtifi had used tales of crisis to emphasize their good deeds and legitimize their power. Now the political thought of the First Intermediate Period provided the foundations for the ruling ideology of the 12th dynasty. By presenting the assassination of Amenemhat I in literary form to the elite of the royal court, the very individuals who posed the greatest threat to the king's life, Senusret gave himself the perfect excuse for a crackdown. His father acquired the status of martyr, the son the role of devoted disciple. Before the 12th dynasty, the Nile Valley had produced scarcely any literature worthy of the name. Ever practical, Egyptian society had had little time or space for mere wordsmiths. Now, Senusret realized, poets and authors might prove just as potent as army commanders. The flowering of literature in the 12th dynasty ranks as one of the greatest cultural achievements of the Middle Kingdom. The works composed for the royal court, some of them undoubtedly at the king's personal behest, are classics, dealing with complex themes and powerful emotions, but all in the service of the royal house. Amenemhat I had explored the possibilities of propagandist literature early in his reign, presenting himself in the prophecies of Nefertiti as the savior of Egypt and the champion of cosmic order following a period of distress and calamity. Senusret I's literati perfected the art with the composition of the outstanding masterpiece of ancient Egyptian literature, the Tale of Sinuhe. It is a fictional story of a courtier who flees Egypt on hearing of the assassination of Amenemhat I. Sinuhe finds refuge at the court of a Palestinian ruler and achieves both wealth and fame in exile. But as his life draws toward a close, he longs to return to Egypt, to embrace everything it stands for, and to be reconciled with the king, its supreme embodiment. The popularity of Sinuhe, which was read and reread for centuries after its composition, is due to its literary brilliance, its narrative flair, and its emotional impact. But the underlying theme of loyalty to the monarch is inextricably interwoven, running as a subliminal thread through the story. As a work both of literature and of propaganda, Sinuhe is exemplary. A rather more blatant example of political literature, the Loyalist Instruction, made loyalty to the king the guiding commandment for righteous living, urging all Egyptians to. And, just in case that exhortation fell on deaf ears, there was a chilling reminder of the surveillance state to back it up. But despite this onslaught of textual injunctions to support the monarchy, the political unrest that had destabilized Egypt during Amenemhat I's reign flared up again. A further expedition had to be dispatched into the western desert to secure the land of the oasis dwellers, 11 while in the Nile Valley itself, temples at Jirti, modern Todd, and Abu, in the south of the country, were looted and destroyed. These acts of desecration were blamed on the usual suspects, Asiatics and Nubians, but were very probably stoked or supported by homegrown insurgents. The king's forces succeeded in restoring law and order. The rebels were rounded up and executed by being burned alive as human torches. Senusret I then pointedly showered attention on local temples throughout the 7 southernmost provinces of Egypt, the old head of the south and heartland of the 11th dynasty. One of the most beautiful of his new buildings was a Jubilee pavilion for the temple of Amun at Ipizit. Its delicate reliefs, in fine white limestone, show the king and God embracing, a visual metaphor for the regime's avowed legitimacy. Yet, side by side with this lofty imagery, the pavilion also demonstrates the Middle Kingdom obsession with bureaucracy. Along the base, the 42 provinces of Egypt are enumerated, each with its representative deity, and the geographical extent of each province is given in river units, roughly 6.5 miles. In Egyptian hands, a decorative scheme intended to demonstrate the all-embracing nature of the king's rule could not resist, including some purely statistical information of the kind beloved by bureaucrats. The administrative practices honed to perfection in provincial capitals. The length and breadth of Egypt came in useful, too, for governing Egyptian-controlled Lower Nubia. The campaign to overthrow Wawat, prosecuted 9 years into the co-regency of Amenemhat I and Senusret I, circa 1909, paved the way for the formal annexation of Nubia as far south as the Second Cataract. Egypt demonstrated its hegemony in characteristic fashion, by embarking on massive state-building projects, in this case fortresses to consolidate its subjugation of the local population. The castles built by Edward I of England following his conquest and annexation of Wales are a more recent example of the same phenomenon. The fortifications, strung out along the river between the First and Second Cataracts, were designed to withstand both surprise attack and protracted siege warfare. Lessons learned, perhaps, during the Civil War half a century earlier. Each fortress comprised a massive rectangular mud brick wall, further strengthened with external towers along the sides and at the corners. The landward wall was guarded by a deep ditch, while on the inner side a low parapet with semicircular bastions and downward-pointing loopholes for archers provided a secondary line of defense. All in all, the Nubian forts were marvels of military architecture, and they must have made a deep impression on the indigenous inhabitants living alongside in their clusters of mud huts. With garrisons now stationed in impregnable bases guarding strategic points along the river, not least the main route to the gold and copper mines of the Eastern Desert, long-term Egyptian control of Wawat was assured. When, in Senusret's 18th year on the throne, his army launched a further campaign as far as the Third Cataract. The general in charge, Mentuhotep, could boast with some justification of having pacified the Southerners. Foreign adventures. By the end of Senusret I's long reign of nearly half a century, 1918 to 1875, the troubles surrounding the beginning of the dynasty had been consigned to history. Egypt and Lower Nubia were under the firm control of the central government. The gold, copper, and precious stones that poured into the royal workshops from mines in Concord. Wawat provided craftsmen with the finest materials, enabling them to create jewelry, statuary, and objets d'art to beautify the royal court, enhance royal prestige, and swell the coffers of the state still further. Through long-distance trade in high-value luxury goods, Egypt's foreign relations were not only confined to trade. Confident. At home, Egypt showed a new willingness to engage in military activity. Abroad to defend its economic interests and secure access to important sources of raw materials. Both facets of foreign policy are illustrated in spectacular fashion during the reign of Senusret I's successor, a second Amenemhat. In the Temple of Jirdi, near Thebes, which had been ransacked by rebels and restored during the reign of Senusret I, 4 copper chests were uncovered, hidden in the foundations. Each was engraved with the name of Amenemhat II, and together they contained a fabulous treasure: beads, seals, and uncut pieces of lapis lazuli, ingots, chains, a model lion, and cups, all of silver, ingots and vessels of pure gold. The hoard remains one of the richest discoveries ever made in the Nile Valley. But it was not just the wealth of the hoard that excited attention. The trade networks it represented were equally impressive. The lapis lazuli came from Mesopotamia and the distant mines of Badakhshan, while the silver cups were of Minoan design and must have come from Crete or a Minoan mercantile community in Syria. A more recent discovery has confirmed this internationalism in Egypt's outlook during the middle of the 12th dynasty. A block of stone from Memphis contains extracts from the annals of Amenemhat II. 1876 to 1842, a detailed journal of the activities of the royal court during the early years of the king's reign. Besides the expected religious festivals and dedications of new cult statues, the most surprising entries record expeditions of a military nature against distant lands. One reads, dispatching an expedition together with the overseer of infantry troops to hack up Asia, a raid that yielded a rich booty of silver, gold, cattle, livestock, and Asiatic slaves. A further campaign against Lebanon added similar plunder to the royal treasury, together with valuable coniferous woods and aromatic oils. Perhaps most intriguing, however, is the entry that records the return of the infantry troops after hacking up Iwa and Iasi, lands that supplied tribute of bronze and malachite as well as wood and slaves. The otherwise unknown land of Iwa may be Ura, a site on the coast of southeastern Turkey. If so, this 12th dynasty expedition would be the only known occasion on which an Egyptian army raided Asia Minor. Iasi is even more tantalizing. The fact that it supplied 2 copper-based materials, bronze and malachite, and the writing of the place name itself, leads to the conclusion that Iasi is probably Cyprus. Under Amenemhat II, Egypt was evidently a major player in the power politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, a full 350 years before the establishment of a formal Egyptian empire in the Near East. According to the annals, the human cargo brought back from these foreign adventures numbered thousands of slaves. Their forcible resettlement in the Nile Valley, to work on crown lands and take part in state-building projects, changed profoundly the ethnic balance of Egypt's population, with long-term, unforeseen consequences. A significant concentration of Asiatic transportees ended up building and servicing the town of Kahan, founded by Amenemhat II's successor, Senusret II, to house the personnel attached to his nearby pyramid. In its strict grid layout, functional zoning, and demarcation of residential quarters by social class, Kahan represents the zenith of centralized planning and the epitome of the structured view of society so favored by the 12th dynasty. Within the massive rectangular enclosure wall, designed as much, we may suspect, to keep people in as to protect them from unwanted intruders, The town was divided into two unequal sections. In the more spacious area lived the senior bureaucrats in their impressive villas, conveniently located for easy access to the town's administrative headquarters. On the other side of the divide, in much more cramped conditions, row upon row of small barrack-like dwellings, separated by narrow alleyways, housed the town's workforce. It was a bald architectural reflection of the them and us attitude so typical of ancient Egyptian officialdom. And in Kahan, as in occupied Wawat, a compound where people could be held under restraint was an essential element in the infrastructure of state control. Indeed, the fact that the 12th dynasty kings followed very much the same policy in Egypt as in conquered Nubia speaks volumes about their worldview. Resources, human as well as material, native as well as foreign, were there to be exploited for the benefit of the crown. People were merely another commodity, to be shipped from place to place according to need. Just as the industrial processes of baking, brewing, and craft manufacture could best be accommodated in regimented barrack-like workshops, so the workforce could be housed in similar fashion. Wherever 12th dynasty settlements are re-encountered, whether in the Nile Delta or in Upper Egypt, they display the same rigid design. They often seem to have been founded on virgin sites, and so must have involved the forcible relocation of entire populations, all at the whim of the state. Hysesistries. This despotic model of monarchy, of order with an iron fist, culminated in the reign of Senusret III, 1836–1818, the most widely attested member of his dynasty. Under his authoritarian rule, all the elements of 12th dynasty control were brought together in one concerted program. Propagandist literature, rigid state planning, centralization of power in Egypt, and conquest and military occupation in Nubia, along with a new vehicle for projecting royal power, portrait sculpture. Beginning with the written and spoken word, Senusret's poets and scriptwriters outdid themselves in the composition of laudatory texts, extolling the king's virtues. The most extreme example is the cycle of hymns, intended, it seems, for recitation on the occasion of a royal visit, or perhaps in front of a statue of the king. And so on, for stanza after stanza. A slightly subtler approach was taken in two monumental works of pessimistic literature, the Complaints of Kakapera Seneb and the Admonitions of Power. Following in the footsteps of the earlier prophecies of Neferti, an elaborate and vivid picture of utter chaos and social turmoil provided the literary background against which the firm rule of the king could be justified as necessary and even beneficent. These highly refined compositions played on the Egyptian mindset, which, molded by the precarious balance of existence and the sharp dichotomies of nature in the Nile Valley, flood and drought, day and night, fertile land and arid desert, saw the world as a constant battle between order and chaos. These works were squarely aimed at the literate elite surrounding the king, who seemed to have wilted under such a sustained barrage of propaganda. Having browbeaten his inner circle into submission, Senusret III turned his attention to the powerful governors, who since the days of the civil war had exercised considerable authority in the provinces of Middle Egypt. In theory, of course, every individual held office at the king's discretion, and it would have been perfectly possible for Senusret simply to dismiss the nomarchs and refuse to appoint successors. But he was too wily an operator for such a blatant display of force against an influential political class. There was no point in risking a reawakening of the dissent that had marred the early years of the 12th dynasty, not when an alternative course of action presented itself. His chosen policy was ruthless, calculated, and brilliant. He neutered the nomarchs, and their potential heirs, under the guise of promoting them, lured away from their regional power bases by the offer of prestigious and lucrative positions at court. Men such as Pnumhotep III of Beni Hassan moved to the royal residence to enjoy the trappings of high office, leaving their provinces to be ruled from the center. Within a generation, nomarchs had disappeared from the Egyptian political scene. And once at court, officials were brought to heel, interred in tombs provided for them by the king, arranged in a neat row in the court cemetery. This dynastic obsession with rigid planning found outlets in the two most ambitious building projects of Senusret III's reign. The first was his pyramid town, a settlement for those who worked on his pyramid at the holy site of Abju. Here, as at Kahan, everything was laid out mathematically, the houses made of uniformly sized mud bricks and organized in blocks 100 cubits wide, separated by streets 5 cubits wide. Again, elite residences occupied the prime spot, highest up, farthest from the cultivation, with its humidity and mosquitoes, while the rest of the population had to make do with cramped conditions on the other side of town. The whole settlement was modestly named Wasut Kakora Ma Keru M Abju, enduring are the places of Kakora, Senusret III's throne name, the justified, in Abju. This proved rather too much for the locals, who shortened its name for everyday purposes to Wasut. The king's most impressive application of zeal and energy, however, was reserved for Nubia. His motivation was threefold: to consolidate Egyptian hegemony in Wawat and establish a new, permanent border, to control trade between Upper Nubia and Egypt, for the benefit of the royal treasury, and to ward off the threat from the powerful kingdom of Kush, with its capital at Kerma, beyond the Third Cataract. His chosen policy was equally impressive in scope: the construction of a line of substantial fortresses throughout the Second Cataract region. Although the forts were designed to operate as an integrated system, each individual fort had its own particular role to play. Kor, on an island in the Nile, served as a campaign palace, a headquarters for the king during military maneuvers. Ikin, modern Mergissa, was the main trading post, sited well within Egyptian-controlled territory. Askut, given the blood-curdling name destroying the Nubians, was the most secure of the forts. It was primarily a fortified granary but also served as a center for forced labor throughout the gold mining region of the Second Cataract. As befitted an arm of state control in conquered territory, the fort was centrally staffed and supplied from distant Egypt, despite the proximity of thriving native settlements. Shalfak, called subduing the foreign lands, was a base for paramilitary patrols, sent into the surrounding desert to monitor the movement of people and goods. Urinardi, or repelling the tribesmen, served as a command center for the regional garrisons and provided a further campaign palace for the king's use. A common feature of all the forts was their inspired use of the local topography to enhance their defensive capability. Curtain walls ran along the line of rocky ridges, steep cliffs were topped with towering battlements, and covered stairs led to the river to ensure access to a water supply in the case of siege. Beyond Urinardi, the most impressive group of forts, and the focus of the entire policy, guarded the narrow Samna Gorge, a natural border that was easy to defend. On the east bank, overlooking the main river channel and preventing infiltration from the eastern desert, stood Kama, opposing the bowmen. Facing it, on the west side of the gorge, was the principal fortress of Samna, powerful as Kakora. The justified, dominated by large barracks, Samna stood ready to seal the gorge and defend Egyptian interests from attack by Kush. In addition to having a permanent garrison of 400 to 500 men, the commander could also quickly summon reinforcements from Urinardi, Ikin, and Buin, farther downstream, via a system of beacons sited at relay stations within sight of each other. In times of peace, the main role of the Samna garrison was to control traffic along this stretch of the Nile. Vessels would moor in the fort's lower pool while cargoes were offloaded onto Egyptian ships or overland donkey caravans for the onward journey to Ikin. A forward base at Samna South, given the belligerent name suppressing the Nubians, provided a holding area for native caravans awaiting permission to continue their journeys, as well as a lookout to monitor people and ships approaching the gorge. Together, the Second Cataract forts presented an awesome display of Egyptian military and administrative might, an architectural expression of the king's power as well as a logistical support for Egyptian interests in the region. No wonder that Senusret III would later be venerated as a god in Wawat, or that Greek historians would dub him High Sesostris. Sesostris was the Greek rendering of Senusret. Just as important as the forts themselves, however, was the system of surveillance they supported. In a remarkable series of documents known as the Samna Dispatches, the patrols that were sent out on a regular basis from Samna South, Samna, Kama, Uranardi, and Shalfak reported their findings to the local commander. In an atmosphere of nervousness approaching paranoia, the patrols adopted an uncompromising stop and search policy. Even small groups of Nubians were intercepted, by force if necessary, and questioned. Those without legitimate business in Egyptian-controlled territory were sent back over the border. A typical dispatch reads, "The patrol who went forth to patrol the desert edge, have come to report to me, saying, we have found the track of 32 men and 3 asses." 13. Every patrol leader signed off his dispatch with the same words, "All the affairs of the king's domain, life, prosperity, health, are safe and sound." One can detect a desperate eagerness to prove that nothing untoward had happened. The determination of the Egyptian authorities to maintain absolute control was certainly in keeping with the 12th dynasty's obsession with security, born of bitter experience, rather than their actions being an unnecessarily macho response to a relatively low threat level. It now appears that fear of attack by the kingdom of Kush was well placed. Egypt's rival on the Upper Nile was wealthy, powerful, and jealous of its northern neighbor, a dangerous combination. So, as an added incentive to his garrisons to fight the good fight, Senusret III had a monumental stela set up inside the fortress at Samna. Its inscription urged the soldiers to defend the king's conquests with the words, "Valorous it is to attack, vile to retreat." 14. Senusret boasted of his own ruthlessness against the Nubians. "I have carried off their women and brought away their dependents, burst forth to poison their wells, driven off their bulls, ripped up their barley, and set fire to it." 15. Total warfare was the Egyptian ideal. Finally, the king had a statue of himself installed in a special shrine at Samna, to inspire his men to loyalty and bravery. The inscription read, "My Majesty has had an image of my Majesty made upon this frontier, so that you will be steadfast for it, so that you will fight for it." 16. It was impossible to resist such a powerful mix of propaganda and coercion, of encouragement and intimidation. Indeed, one look at a typical statue of Senusret III would have been enough to convince any soldier to do his duty. Never before in the history of ancient Egypt had a king used sculpture so effectively to project so terrifying an image of royal power. Senusret III's statues, and there are many of them, have a deeply unsettling effect. The torso is always taut, muscular, and virile, presenting the ideal of youthful vigor beloved of Egyptian kings. But it is the face that haunts the viewer, bulging eyes under hooded lids, sunken cheeks, a brooding, downturned mouth. This radical departure from the conventions of royal portraiture is at once mesmerizing and terrifying. His is the true face of tyranny. Adding to the effect are the outsize ears, their message being that Senusret was the all-hearing monarch. Those who spoke out of turn were likely to regret their indiscretion. The 12th dynasty police state continued under the king's iron grip for another half-century after Senusret III. His successor, Amenemhat III, 1818–1770, favored a meaner style of portraiture alongside archaic forms of sculpture, designed to underline the antiquity of kingship. The achievements of his reign were spectacular: massive reclamation and building works in the Fayum, not one but 2 pyramids, the first having developed cracks just as it neared completion, and an upsurge in mining and quarrying expeditions to bring back precious stones for the royal workshops, 4 expeditions to the Wadi Hammamat for Greywacke, 3 to the Wadi El Hudi for amethyst, and no fewer than 23 to the Sinai for turquoise. In cultural terms, his reign marks the high point of the 12th dynasty. Fueled by Nubian gold, trade with the Near East prospered, too. The king rewarded his loyal allies, the princes of Khabni, by showering them with gifts. They, in turn, became increasingly Egyptianized in an attempt to emulate their powerful sponsors. Close ties between the Egyptians and their Asiatic neighbors were also maintained in the Sinai Peninsula, where the local Palestinian rulers provided logistical support to the Egyptian mining expeditions. With friendly relations established, the peaceful immigration of Asiatics into Egypt, especially into the northeastern delta, replaced the forcible resettlement of Asiatic slaves that had taken place earlier in the dynasty. Semitic-speaking Asiatics from the Sinai, with their experience in desert travel, made ideal recruits for Egypt's paramilitary police force patrolling the western desert. Interacting with Egyptian military scribes, they developed a hybrid script for writing their own language, the earliest alphabetic script in history. But the steady buildup of an Asiatic population in the Nile Valley and Delta would soon make itself felt in other ways as well, with disastrous consequences for Egypt. At the end of Amenemhat III's long reign of nearly 5 decades, the unthinkable happened. The dynasty found itself without a youthful male heir to carry the torch for another generation. As an emergency measure, the old king had an aged relative crowned co-regent. But whether through lack of personal charisma, faltering political support, or merely old age, Amenemhat IV failed to make an impression during his decade on the throne. He was succeeded in turn by a daughter of Amenemhat III, Sobhaneferu, 1760 to 1755. The accession of Egypt's first female king, there was no word for queen, the very notion being anathema to ancient Egyptian ideology, was a sure sign that the 12th dynasty had run out of steam. Desperate to bolster her legitimacy, she emphasized her relationship with her father, virtually ignoring her ineffective predecessor, and concentrated her building activities at Hawara, where Amenemhat III had constructed his second pyramid complex. But after a brief reign of just 4 years, Sobhaneferu, too, was gone. The dynasty that had begun with a bang ended with a whimper. Without the smack of firm government, the forces of disorder, both inside and outside the country, saw their chance. Chapter 9. Bitter Harvest. The miserable Asiatic. The ancient Egyptians had a natural superiority complex. They liked to think of themselves as a civilization apart, their beloved country uniquely blessed and protected from less fortunate neighbors by its natural borders of sea and desert. This self-image could not have been further from the truth. Situated at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, Egypt was always a melting pot of peoples and cultural influences. From time immemorial, the fertile fields of the Nile Valley and Delta were a magnet for migrants from the harsher, arid lands to the west, east, and south. In turn, the industry, technology, and customs of successive waves of immigrants enriched and renewed Egyptian civilization. On occasions, however, peoples from neighboring lands came to Egypt with less benevolent intentions, bringing notions of conquest along with cultural innovations. Such invasions were rare and generally repulsed or kept at bay by a strong centralized state. But at times of political weakness, Egypt was more vulnerable, especially along its porous northeastern border. The exhaustion of the Middle Kingdom state at the end of the 12th dynasty offered just such an opportunity to Egypt's envious and ambitious neighbors. The result was very nearly catastrophic for the survival of pharaonic culture. Obsessive about internal security and border defenses, the 12th dynasty monarchs had taken considerable steps to fortify the frontier along the northeastern delta, sealing it completely, as had been done at Samna, in Nubia, was impossible because of the nature of the terrain. But the walls of the ruler, built by Amenemhat I and strengthened by his successors, established a forbidding line of fortifications to deter foreign aggressors. In addition, the forts themselves supported a regular system of patrols to monitor, intercept, and regulate the movement of peoples across the border. Jaru, modern Tel El Hibua, was the linchpin of Egypt's northeastern defenses, and was as impressive a fortress as any unconquered Wawat. Yet despite this iron curtain, migration into the delta by Semitic-speaking peoples from the Near East not only continued but accelerated during the course of the 12th dynasty. Some of the settlers may have been prisoners of war, captured and brought back from the campaigns of Amenemhat II and Senusret III. Others were undoubtedly legal migrants, employed by the Egyptian state to assist The state sponsored mining expeditions to the Sinai, to work on major construction projects in the Fayum, or to act as guides, desert trackers, and police on the country's desert fringes. By the late 12th dynasty, the miserable Asiatic, as one 12th dynasty text put it, formed a significant element in the population, and immigrants from the Near East began to rise through the ranks of Egyptian society, even winning promotion to government positions. In the northeastern Delta, where many of these migrants had originally settled, what started life as a small community of foreign workers soon became a magnet for much larger waves of immigration, as people fleeing the harsher climatic and economic conditions of their homelands sought sanctuary and opportunities for betterment with their relatives and compatriots in Egypt. One site in particular was the focus of this sustained influx. The town of Hutware, modern Tel El Daba, on the eastern bank of the Nile's Pelusiac branch, had been established as a small border settlement by the Heracleopolitan dynasty and had been refounded by Amenemhat I as part of his frontier defenses. However, under the weak rule of his descendants Amenemhat IV and Sobonneferu, the system of surveillance must have broken down, allowing a steady stream of immigrants to cross the border. Once settled at Hutware, they built houses in their own tradition and maintained their own way of life. Yet these immigrants were not entirely ignorant of Egyptian customs. Quite the reverse. Many of them were already highly Egyptianized before settling at Hutware, suggesting that they had come from the Lebanese port city of Kibni, with its long-standing cultural and political ties to Egypt. Others may have come from Cyprus. Among these long-distance migrants were Bedouin tribespeople from southern Palestine, swept up in the great tide of human migration pouring into the Nile Delta. It was a heady mix of languages, peoples, and traditions that rapidly transformed Hutware into a multicultural town, unlike anywhere else in Egypt. Since people of Asiatic origin had already attained high office elsewhere in Egypt, it is not surprising that the opportunities for advancement were even greater at Hutware. One prominent dignitary chose to express his social standing in quintessentially Egyptian form by means of a large stone statue for his tomb chapel. But he also emphasized his non-Egyptian background by the style of his portrait. His large, red, mushroom-shaped coiffure marking him out as an immigrant from Kibni, his yellow skin color conforming to the traditional Egyptian convention for depicting Asiatics. The curved throw stick that he held in one hand served as both a symbol of office and an ethnic identifier, since this peculiar object was the very hieroglyph used to write the word Asiatic. Here was a man proud of his foreign ancestry and willing, it seems, to flaunt it in defiance of Egyptian xenophobia. After little more than a generation, the Asiatic population of Hutware had grown confident in its distinctive hybrid culture, prosperous from Mediterranean trade, and increasingly willing to flex its political muscles. An imposing mansion was built as the official residence for the town governor, the equal of anything at Kahan or Wasut. Indeed, it was a palace of royal pretensions. In its grounds, high-ranking officials were interred in lavish tombs, each marked according to Asiatic custom by a pair of donkeys buried at the entrance. One of these high-status tombs belonged to a man calling himself the overseer of retinue, a title usually borne by the Egyptian official in charge of relations with Syria-Palestine. Another tomb belonged to a chief steward and treasurer. Although these titles seem to demonstrate the continued reach of the central government, it is debatable to what extent the elite of Hutware still considered themselves answerable to the king in Ijta'i. In any case, the royal court had its mind on other problems. Monarchy without majesty after 2 centuries of rule by a single family, the government machine, found itself singularly ill-prepared for the succession crisis that followed the brief reign of Sobonneferu. It is as if the elite had simply forgotten how earlier generations had coped when faced with the extinction of the royal line. The result was a rapid turnover in the office of kingship to mirror the chaos at the end of the Old Kingdom. Kings came and went with bewildering rapidity, reigning for periods of mere months or even days as the throne passed from claimant to claimant. Over the course of 150 years, Egypt had no fewer than 50 kings, the so-called 13th dynasty, compared to just 8 in the preceding 2 centuries. In all likelihood, the most powerful families in the land. Unable to agree on a single candidate, opted for the mechanism of a rotating succession. Since the elderly members of each rival lineage were the most likely to command respect at court, Egypt effectively became a gerontocracy, with one aged king after another attempting to make his mark. Despite this travesty of traditional monarchy, the administration continued as before with a surprising degree of efficiency, a reminder, perhaps, that the real business of government fell to viziers and treasurers rather than their royal masters. In official documents, leading bureaucrats were content to pay lip service to the age-old custom of the royal prerogative, even if officials were now appointing the king, rather than the other way around. In the country at large, it was harder to paper over the cracks. Private individuals stopped invoking the king or the royal residence on their funerary monuments, no longer convinced that it would make any difference to their chances of an afterlife. Now, it seemed, the king was barely around long enough to make provision for his own pyramid building all but stalled, many kings making do with a shaft tomb cut inside the pyramid enclosure of one of their 12th dynasty forebears. Expeditions to the Sinai ceased altogether. All the outward trappings of might and majesty disappeared from a beleaguered monarchy. The accession of Sopotep III, circa 1680, perhaps the 26th king of the 13th dynasty, provides a stark illustration of the changes that had overtaken Egypt in a mere half-century. In sharp contrast to many of his predecessors, Sopotep openly flaunted his non-royal origins, making a virtue of the fact that he had no royal blood in his veins. He lauded his non-royal parents in a series of commemorative inscriptions and confidently publicized his commoner relatives. It all suggests a deep-seated malaise in the very institution of monarchy. Sopotep III's background in the military, with some time in the king's personal bodyguard, would certainly have given him an intimate knowledge of court politics. As king, he turned this to his advantage, increasing the number of key government officials and restarting royal building projects to restore some measure of stability to the administration. But it was not to last. The heartbeat of royal government was faltering, even the odd burst of activity could not mask that reality. The crisis was felt particularly acutely at Egypt's distant outposts, the fortresses of occupied Wawat. An emasculated administration found itself unable to maintain the system of rotating garrisons that had staffed the forts during their heyday in the 12th dynasty. One by one, the Nubian forts were relinquished by the Egyptian government, which was now incapable of extending its writ beyond the traditional borders of the two lands. The forts of the Sumna Gorge were the last to be abandoned, as the 13th dynasty did its feeble best to uphold Senusret III's frontier. Eventually, even Sumna itself was handed over to its small resident population as the remaining government envoys packed their bags and departed for the last time. Left to their own devices, and increasingly uncertain of receiving logistical support or provisions from the capital, some of the fortress communities started to think the unthinkable and look southward to another potential sponsor. The Kingdom of Kush might have been Egypt's sworn enemy, but at least it had the gold to pay those in its employ. A similar fate awaited the fortresses of the northeastern delta. With their patrols discontinued and their garrisons recalled home, central control of Egypt's most vulnerable frontier effectively ceased. It did not take long for an ambitious leader to fill the power vacuum. A man named Niasi not only took charge of the fortresses, but he promptly declared himself king of an independent delta state, with its capital at Hutware, in direct challenge to the government at Ajtawi. Safe within his power base, Niasi knew exactly what was expected of a legitimate Egyptian king. He upheld the traditional system of administration and put himself under the patronage of his local deity, Seth, Lord of Hutware. An Egyptian temple founded in the town at this time may have been the concrete manifestation of Niasi's public piety, although it was dwarfed by an adjacent temple of Asiatic style, indicative of the mixed culture prevalent throughout Hutware. With oak trees shading its forecourt and a vivid blue painted exterior, this Asiatic temple on Egyptian soil was one of the largest anywhere in the Near East. It amply demonstrates the confidence and prosperity of INNOCENCE's royal foundation. Yet, despite its initial stability, his newly established dynasty was not without difficulties. The deliberate vandalism of earlier tombs, the statue with the mushroom-shaped coiffure was smashed to pieces and its inlaid eyes gouged out, hints at civil unrest, and society was heavily militarized. Soldiers were buried with their weapons at the ready, and the town echoed to the sounds of metalworkers making new armaments. In earlier times, the secession of a province would have been met with a swift and ruthless response from the center. But the government at Ijtai was hardly in a fit state to win back Hutware by force. Indeed, INNOCENCE's declaration of independence dealt the 13th dynasty regime a body blow, cutting the dynasty's remaining links with the Near East and starving it of trade income. The dynasty limped on, retaining the vestigial trappings of state power, but with little conviction. The end was not long in coming. Within a few decades, the government at Ijtai and the breakaway Delta dynasty were both brought down by a combination of natural and man-made disasters. At Hutware, famine and plague devastated the population. Whole families of adults and children were buried together, hugger-mugger, without the usual careful preparations. A series of extremely short reigns at the end of the 13th dynasty suggests a similar calamity farther south. Weakened by disease, the whole of Lower Egypt became easy prey to an outside aggressor. From over the border, a force of well-equipped invaders, armed with the latest military technology, horse-drawn chariots, stormed Egypt, taking beleaguered Hutware and sweeping on southward to conquer the ancient capital of Memphis. The Hyksos had arrived. Rulers of foreign lands. The Hyksos were a unique phenomenon in the history of ancient Egypt. For more than a century, 1630 to 1520, a Semitic-speaking elite from coastal Lebanon ruled northern Egypt and were recognized as overlords in the rest of the country. They transformed their capital at Hutware into a town wholly Asiatic in culture, worshipped a foreign god, Baal, and were buried following foreign rites. Their very names were alien, and their conquests seemed to later generations, and perhaps to some at the time, to represent the destruction of created order itself. For the century of their rule, their heartland in the northeastern delta prospered as never before, thanks to vibrant trade with other parts of the eastern Mediterranean and more distant lands. Hutware expanded to 2 or 3 times its previous size, and became the nerve center of a mini-empire that encompassed parts of southern Palestine and the Lebanese coast. The loss of Memphis to these invaders dealt the 13th dynasty a fatal blow, both psychological and practical. Egypt's ancient capital symbolized the very concept of national unity, while its location at the junction of the Nile Valley and the Delta was the key to controlling the internal movement of goods and people. The Hyksos takeover of such a strategic objective forced the royal court to abandon Ijtai and beat a hasty retreat southward. There was not even time, apparently, to gather up precious temple and state archives, with the result that the successors of the 13th dynasty would have to reinvent the canon of religious texts without reference to the accumulated wisdom of earlier generations. As for the court itself, it swiftly re-established a government of sorts at Thebes, traditional heartland of Egyptian independence. But the court's writ had collapsed and now extended over just the 7 southernmost nomes of Egypt, the old head of the south from which the Middle Kingdom had been born 6 centuries earlier. For a short time, while the government in exile came to terms with the new political reality and consolidated its strictly limited authority, parts of the central Nile Valley experienced a power vacuum. At Abju, cult center of Osiris, such an absence of divine kingship from the apex of society was particularly calamitous. So the local elite took matters into their own hands and established their own ruling dynasty. But without the usual accoutrements of skilled craftsmen and trained bureaucrats, these kings of Abju presented a dejected picture of monarchy, their crudely fashioned monuments at odds with their royal pretensions. It was a valiant attempt to preserve Egypt's most important institution at the country's most important center of worship. But good intentions were no match for the well-organized and well-resourced Hyksos. After little more than 20 years, the Abju dynasty was snuffed out, leaving barely a trace in the record. Farther south, at Thebes, the refugees from Ijtai fared somewhat better. For many in Upper Egypt, they were still the only legitimate lords of the two lands, and they continued to receive loyal service from the same families who had held office under the old regime. Yet, this apparent continuity was an illusion. In reality, the situation had changed utterly. In more settled times, Thebes had been a great city, favored by royal patronage and prosperous from its trade links with every part of Egypt and Nubia. Now, cut off from the Near East by the Hyksos presence in the north, and from southern lands by the loss of the oases and the Nubian forts, Thebes was a shadow of its former self, weak, impoverished, and vulnerable. The gods, too, seemed to have deserted the Egyptians in their hour of need, sending natural disasters to compound the people's misery. Less than a decade after the abandonment of Ijtai, the native Egyptians faced a bitter blow. When floodwaters overwhelmed the temple of Amun at Ipizit, sacred epicenter of their Theban realm, the king decided the only course of action was to lead by example, wading into the temple's submerged broad hall to inspect the damage, his bedraggled entourage in dejected attendance. The next Egyptian monarch faced even worse, a combination of famine, flood, and attack. Neferhotep III claimed to have nourished Thebes during the worst of the food shortage, and to have protected his city when it was sunk, but when the weakened population found itself under attack from advancing Hyksos armies, the best Neferhotep could do was steel the resolve of the populace and make it brave, in its dealings with foreigners. Stressing the ruler's role as military leader was one way to rally the troops, but Neferhotep's adoption of epithets such as Guide of Mighty Thebes smacks more of hope than expectation. From the monarch to his humblest subject, there was the gnawing fear that Thebes, like Memphis before it, would fall to the invaders. The most telling royal inscription from the time is the commemorative stela, erected at Ipizit by King Mentuhotep I, a reassuringly old-fashioned Theban name, if written in a curiously provincial manner. In quintessential Egyptian fashion, the text is full of boast and bluster. Mentuhotep I comparing his army to crocodiles on the flood. Yet, when it came to his own power, his choice of words betrayed the uncomfortable truth: I am king within Thebes, this my city. For trying to emphasize his legitimacy, Mentuhotep I called himself one who acts as king. Not even the most ephemeral ruler of the 13th dynasty would have needed to protest so cravenly about his royal credentials. The Egyptian monarchy was in a piteous state indeed. Nothing underlined this decline more starkly than the fate of the Nubian fortresses, abandoned by the central government in the dying days of the 13th dynasty. The Egyptian inhabitants left behind had looked elsewhere for employment. The kingdom of Kush, the dominant power on the Upper Nile, a prosperous trading nation in its own right, Egypt's sworn enemy, and the very reason behind the fort's construction, needed no further bidding. Expanding its territory northward, it assimilated Wawat and took over control of the forts, meeting little if any resistance. During the period of Hyksos control in the north, the Egyptian expatriates living in Wawat, both civilian and military personnel, willingly served their new Nubian masters. At Buin, a man named Ka boasted, I was a brave servant of the ruler of Kush. His colleague Subtur, the fortress commandant, even helped rebuild the temple of Horus at Buin to the satisfaction of the ruler of Kush. In the dedication of his commemorative inscription, Subtur covered all eventualities, invoking the Egyptian funerary god Ptah Sakkar Osiris, the local deity Horus, lord of Buin, and even the deified Senusret III, but also the unnamed gods that are in Wawat. He was clearly hedging his bets. Senusret III would have turned in his grave. The tables were now turned on the Egyptians. It was they, Noth Nubians, who had to pay taxes on trade shipments. They, not the Nubians, who could be told where, what, and when they could trade. The heyday of the 12th dynasty must have seemed a distant memory. The Hyksos kingdom, by contrast, was flourishing. as existing. Networks of Asiatic immigrants absorbed more newcomers. Settlements and their associated cemeteries sprung up throughout the Eastern Delta. A large fortified town was founded at Tel El Yahudiya, complementing the defensive installations taken over by the Hyksos. Elsewhere in the frontier zone, confident in their new homeland, the Hyksos rulers gave full expression to their distinctive cultural identity. At Hutware, altars blazed with burnt offerings in front of the main temple, which was dedicated to Baal-Zephon, the Syrian storm god, who had rapidly assimilated the cult of the Egyptians' own storm god, Seth. Infants who died young had their remains interred, according to Asiatic custom, in imported Palestinian amphorae, even though Egyptian amphorae were stronger and would have offered better protection. In matters of trade, too, the Hyksos consciously turned their backs on Egypt, eschewing commerce with Middle Egypt or the south, although they continued to secure gold from Kush via the Oasis route, in favor of dealings with Palestine and Cyprus. Wine, olive oil, timber, and copper flowed into the bustling harbor at Hutware, swelling its coffers and making it one of the greatest royal cities in the entire Near East. 2. Proclaim their economic and political might, the Hyksos rulers built a great citadel on the banks of the Nile, occupying more than half a million square feet of river frontage on reclaimed land. It was surrounded by a huge curtain wall 25 feet thick, fortified with buttresses. Inside the compound, the royal residence was a place of luxury and opulence. Gardens and vineyards provided fresh produce and offered shade from the Egyptian sun, while a carefully constructed stone-lined channel delivered fresh water from the river directly into the heart of the palace. Surrounded by such affluence, a change came over the Hyksos rulers. The earlier kings had been content to describe themselves as rulers of foreign lands, in ancient Egyptian, Hekau Kasut, the derivation of the term Hyksos, a moniker that had been used in the Middle Kingdom for the princes of Near Eastern city-states. The accession of King Kian, circa 1610, however, brought a new outlook and marked the apogee of Hyksos power. Determined to be recognized as a proper Egyptian sovereign, commensurate with his exalted economic status, he sent a diplomatic gift to the Minoan ruler of Crete at Knossos, announcing his arrival on the world stage. For domestic consumption, he adopted a full royal titulary, headed by the Horus name he who embraces the banks of the Nile. It was, as ever, a statement of political intent as much as ideology. Kian's objective was to break out of the Hyksos heartland and bring all of Egypt within his embrace. A military advance through Middle Egypt cowed the northern two-thirds of the country into submission. It is even possible that the Hyksos armies succeeded in conquering Thebes for a year or two before marching back to their delta base, laying waste to towns and temples as they retreated. Kian's successor, King Apepi, 1570-1530, went one step further in his public pronouncements, taking the Horus name pacifier of the two lands, redolent of Amenemhat Ayat, the outset of the 12th dynasty, and describing himself on one of his monuments as beloved of Seth, Lord of Sumenu. By claiming the divine sanction of a god within the Theban's own heartland, Sumenu was a town only a few miles from Thebes. Apepi was thereby claiming the crown of the entire country. Things had never looked darker for the survival of an independent Egyptian kingdom. Down but not out. Yet, somehow, despite all the setbacks, the flame of Egyptian self-determination, or the ambition of the Ancien regime to be restored to power, was never quite extinguished. The withdrawal of the Hyksos forces from Upper Egypt, back to their Delta power base, offered a glimmer of hope to the Thebans, a chance to reconstruct and regroup. The new king of Thebes, Rahotep, who is identified as the first ruler of the 17th dynasty, began the program of repairs to shrines devastated by the Hyksos armies. At Gebtu, he ordered restoration work to commence at the Temple of Min, noting that its gates and doors are fallen into ruin. 8. At the holy site of Abju, the cult of Osiris Kenchementu was revived. Both acts were about symbolism as much as preservation of monuments. By beautifying the temples of the gods, and reinstating ancient religious practices, Rahotep was clearly signaling his intention to be a legitimate Egyptian ruler, one who carried out the most important duties of kingship. His successors followed suit, repairing the temple at Abju and making additions there. And at Gebtu. Both sites, key players during Egypt's first civil war, were again at the forefront of Theban strategy. This went beyond religious activity to encompass practical politics as well. Military garrisons were established at both Gebtu and Abju as forward bridgeheads to be used in any fight against the Hyksos. The groundwork was being laid for a Theban resurgence. The successors of King Rahotep also set about resuscitating another traditional royal prerogative, pyramid building. While the tombs of Neferhotep III and his ilk had been miserable affairs, little more than burial shafts sunk in the rock, the 17th dynasty rulers were intent upon recalling the glory days of the Middle Kingdom. So, on the steep hillside of Dra Abu el Naga, in western Thebes, they founded a new royal necropolis. The tomb of Nubkapera-Intef, fourth king of the dynasty, is the best known. The burial chamber was hewn into the cliff face and was entered via a descending shaft, but this was only the private aspect of the tomb. Marking its location on the surface, for all to see, was a steep-sided pyramid, built against the hillside and contained within a rather shoddily built brick retaining wall. The pyramid was also made from mud bricks. These were early days in the Theban Renaissance, and quarrying large amounts of stone was still beyond the means of the fledgling dynasty. But the tomb was plastered and whitewashed to give at least the vague appearance of a stone monument with a smooth casing. At 43 feet in height, the pyramid barely registered next to the monuments of the 12th dynasty, but the intention was there, even if the resources were not. In a similar vein, Intef had to make do with a reused statue, probably pilfered from the nearby mortuary temple of Mentuhotep II. Even if Nubkapera-Intef lacked the means to be a great king, he certainly had the resolve. On the obelisks erected in front of his tomb, he made another, highly significant public gesture of his determination to revive Egypt's fortunes. In carefully cut hieroglyphs, he associated himself with some of the most important deities of Egypt: Osiris Khenshumentu, the god of Abju, guarantor of a blessed resurrection and afterlife; Anubis, lord of the necropolis, the jackal god of mummification who presided over burials, and, perhaps curious in such funereal company, Sopdu, lord of foreign lands. But the inclusion of Sopdu was no mistake. This rather minor deity had two crucial attributes. He was the patron god of foreign lands, especially the hill country of the Sinai and southern Palestine, and his cult center was located in the eastern delta at Persopdu, squarely inside the Hyksos kingdom. It was a classic instance of theological tit for tat. If Keon could claim the patronage of a Theban god to bolster his assertion of political hegemony, then Intef could do likewise and put himself under the protection of a delta god with special responsibility for foreign lands. With Sopdu's blessing, the Theban 17th dynasty might hope to beat the foreigners at their own game and regain control of the lands lost to the invaders. Divine support was one thing, but practical politics was quite another. Before Nubkapera-Intef could hope to start mobilizing his supporters in a fight against the Hyksos, he had to consolidate his dynasty's grip on power in its own backyard. It was a case of united we stand, divided we fall. A remarkable document attesting to this realignment of power has been preserved at Gebtu. It is a royal decree by Nubkapera-Intef settling an internal dispute that had arisen within the powerful bureaucracy running the Temple of Min. The details of the Sari affair are not recorded, but the king's verdict on the perpetrator, Minhotep, was clear and unequivocal. We may suspect that Minhotep's seditious behavior was not an act of sacrilege against the temple itself but a move against Intef's loyal supporters, especially since the beneficiary of Minhotep's excommunication was the mayor of Gebtu, Minmhat, a devoted servant of the 17th dynasty. By such means, throughout the temples and towns of Upper Egypt, the Theban king steadily concentrated power in the hands of men they knew they could trust. The result was a unified and close-knit administration, ready and eager to relearn and restore traditional protocols and modes of government. Nubkapera Intef's successor, Sobekemsf II, circa 1560, showed his own aptitude for this program of renewal when he sent a quarrying expedition to the Wadi Hammamat, no doubt with logistical support from the regime's new friends at Gebtu. It was the first such state-sponsored mission in 160 years. True, it may have comprised just 130 men, compared to the 19,000 who took part in an expedition under Senusret I, and the personnel may have been recruited somewhat haphazardly, but it was a start. Deeper in the eastern desert, at the mines of Gabled site, work started up again. Assisted by mercenaries recruited from the desert Medjay people. As well as procuring materials for a renaissance in the royal workshops. The Theban administration was beginning to stretch itself, flexing its muscles and honing its responses in readiness for war. In the clearest sign yet that battle plans were being drawn up, Sobekemsf made a new donation of land to the local temple at Madu, modern Madamud, a few miles outside Thebes. The choice of recipient was no accident. For the god of Madu was none other than Montu, the Theban war god, who had inspired the 11th dynasty to victory in the struggle for reunification 6 centuries earlier. Perhaps Montu would assist a new generation of Theban warriors in their own battle for national salvation. Just as everything looked ready, fate dealt the 17th dynasty a cruel blow. From the distant reaches of Nubia, via the Egyptian built fortresses of Wawat, a great army raised by the ruler of Kush swept northward, attacking towns and villages in Upper Egypt, ransacking temples and tombs, and carrying off the spoils. What was alarming for the Egyptians was that the Kushites were not alone but had recruited allies to their cause. Kush came, having agitated the tribes of Wawat, all the peoples of Upper Nubia, Punt, and the Medjay. This was a formidable coalition, embracing the inhabitants of Nubia, who no doubt relished a chance to get even with their erstwhile oppressors, but also the people of the far-off land of Punt and the eastern desert. Medjay, always ready to offer their services to the highest bidder. The doughty townspeople of Nekeb, at the center of the firestorm, put up stiff resistance under the brave leadership of their governor, repelling the invaders and forcing them back beyond the first cataract. Even so, the governor himself lost property to the pillaging horde, and the Theban side sustained casualties it could ill afford. The Kushite invasion came as a dreadful shock, but provided a salutary lesson too. The 17th dynasty, before they could safely launch their campaign for national reunification, in which loyal soldiers from Nekeb would play a leading role, they would first have to secure their southern flank. The fight back begins. In the Hyksos capital at Hutware, King Apepi must have sensed the impending outbreak of hostilities. He took the precaution of strengthening the fortified enclosure wall of the royal citadel, and of forming a strategic military alliance with Kush, using the desert route via the oases, which the Hyksos had controlled since the early days of their rule. His messengers could communicate with the ruler of Kush without having to pass through Theban territory. Apepi might have to offer Kush a share of the spoils, but carving up Egypt between the two powers would be an acceptable compromise if it meant the end of Egyptian independence for good. Without a hint of irony, Apepi used an age-old Egyptian trick to rally his supporters for the fight ahead. In a barrage of propaganda, the Asiatic king proclaimed his power with new and ever more elaborate epithets, strong-willed on the day of battle, with a greater name than any other king, protector of distant lands who have never glimpsed him. 11 To sum up, he claimed, there is not his like in any land. 12. The new Theban ruler, Seqenra was supremely unfazed by this fighting talk. Instead of indulging in a war of words, he made preparations for the real conflict. His first move was to establish a forward campaign headquarters, from which the assault on Memphis and Hutware could be planned and directed. The chosen location was Deir el-Balas, on the west bank of the Nile opposite Gebtu. There he built a fortified palace compound to accommodate the royal family. It was served by a bakery complex and surrounded by a substantial settlement for members of the king's entourage. Overlooking the entire site, atop a high hill, there was a lookout post with commanding views of the Nile Valley. All in all, it was the perfect defensive location. With his strategic command and control center up and running, TAA launched the first wave of attacks against Hicks's forces. And he was no armchair general. He led from the front, his tall frame, muscular body, and large head topped by thick, curly black hair making him every inch the war hero. Drawing strength from his own sense of destiny, and stiffened by the resolve of his feisty sister wife, Ahotep, he engaged the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. Then, disaster. In the thick of battle, the king fell, perhaps struck from behind, while riding his chariot. Unprotected, he was set upon by his attackers with daggers, axes, and spears. An Asiatic axe penetrated his skull, causing a massive head injury and killing TAA outright. In the chaos and confusion, it was impossible to prepare the corpse properly for burial. Instead, the dead king was hastily embalmed, without even his limbs being straightened, and taken back to Thebes. There, before a grieving family and a stunned populace, TAA the Brave, as the inscription on his coffin called him, was laid to rest, his designated successor, Kamos, leading the mourners. TAA had been cut down in his prime, after a reign of barely 4 years, 1545 to 1541. The mantle of office, and the hopes of the Egyptians, now rested on Kamos's shoulders. Inexperienced and unsure how to proceed, the new monarch summoned his war council. In heartfelt and anguished tones, he bemoaned his and his country's fate. Why do I ponder my strength while there is one prince in Hutware and another in Kush, and I sit joined with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each man holding his portion of Egypt and sharing the land with me? 13 Never before in the 1400 years since the foundation of the state had Egypt's fortune sunk to such a low ebb. The country had experienced disunity and insurgency in the past, but this was different. With Egypt threatened and occupied by foreign powers to the north and south, the very existence of an independent Egypt, ruled by Egyptians, looked precarious. In order for the two lands to survive, let alone prosper again, it would require further toil, sacrifice, and bloodshed, and an unshakable resolve to prevail.